Rafe Doss stood at the front of the little clapboard church at Kiln Springs, with his hat crushed flat in both hands and the sweat running cold down the hollow of his back, and he kept his eyes fixed on the scuffed pine floor because there was nowhere else in that packed room a broke man could look and keep the last of himself. He was 34 years old, that dry spring of 1887, a long-shanked brush hand gone lean as a saddle string on other men's ground and other men's wages. A man who had spent his whole life afoot and horseback in the thickets, grubbing cedar and running strays for a day's pay, and he owned nothing on this earth but the clothes gone pale on his back and a debt he could not climb out from under, and the debt he owed to the man in the front pew. That man was Cyrus Vane, the biggest fine wool and mutton baron on the whole Chalk River, thick through the neck and iron gray at the temple, and dressed in a good dark coat that had never once been caught out in weather. A merino king who ran his blooded ewes on the sweet grass benches and shipped his clip east by the wagon load, and set the price of wool for the entire basin, because there was no other price a man could get. And it was Vane who settled the thing aloud, because in that country it was always Cyrus Vane who spoke first and spoke last, and he did not so much as trouble himself to rise up out of the pew to do it. "I'll say it plain, Doss," he said, and he threw his voice out easy and unhurried to fill the little room, so that every soul in that church leaned the smallest bit forward to catch the shape of it. "You marry the Croft woman here today, the big Croft girl, the wool stapler's odd daughter this county's had its laugh at for 10 years and better, and I tear up your paper, every note you've put your mark to, clean through, down to the last dollar. A man ought to start his married life owing nothing to nobody." A low ripple went through the pews at that, and Vane let it run its course the way a man lets a rope run before he snubs it, and then he laid the rest of it down soft and flat as a card slid off the top of the deck. "And seeing as it's a wedding," he said, and he was smiling now, the smile costing him not one thin dime, "I'll make the two of you a present besides. That band of brush goats running loose up in the cedar breaks, every half-wild, worthless head of them, the whole scrub passel, nobody's mark on a hair of them, and nobody wanting them. Yours, and the breaks along with, all that broke brush country under the rimrock that the counties took to calling the ruint, ground no common nor sheepman ever could hold nor cared to. Yours, free and clear, both your names down at the clerk's before the week is out." The laughter came then, and it was not cruel exactly, only certain, the comfortable, easy, well-fed laughter of people who all of them know the same joke and have known it a long while and take a quiet pleasure in hearing it told again out loud. Because every man and woman in Kiln Springs knew the cedar breaks, a wilderness of tumbled draw and thicketed bluff folded up under the north rimrock, a hard-broken country of cedar and shinnery and thornbrush and live oak and hidden nothing, ground so choked and rocky and dry-looking and worthless that the wool outfits and the cow outfits alike had left it long ago to the coyote and the scrub goats and the wind, and the county in its plain way had stopped even bothering with the proper name of it and just called it the ruint. And they all of them saw at once, in that one laughing breath, how neat the whole thing was, how tidy, how perfectly and beautifully economical. For Cyrus Vane had wiped a bad debt clean off his ledger without laying out a dollar, and he had unloaded onto the town full a stretch of broke brush country he could not have sold, nor leased, nor given away to any man with the sense God gave a goose. And he had rid Kiln Springs of its oldest standing joke of a spinster, that great plain odd Croft woman the county had been laughing at for 10 years, and he had done all three of those things in one single, open-handed stroke that made him look like Christian charity walking, and it had cost him not 1 cent, not 1 blade of his good grass, not 1 head of anything he would ever in his life have trouble to own. There is a kind of joke that a whole town can love because it lets everybody in it feel clever and kind at the same moment, and this was that joke, and they laughed it warm. That is the whole of it, right there in that laughing little church, Kiln Springs, up in the high brush and limestone country where the Chalk River comes down off the rimrock. in the dry spring of 1887, and before I carry you one single step further along this road, I want to know where you are riding in from tonight. So do me the small kindness of dropping the name of your town down in the comments below, because this story is fixing to travel a great deal farther than any soul in that church would ever have credited, and I would dearly like to see just how far it reaches before we are through. And you stay with me now, all the way, clear down to the last word, because I am not going to stand up here and promise you a love story. Love comes into it, it does, in its own slow time and its own small, quiet measure, always a half step behind the work and never once making a show of itself. But that is not the promise, and I will not cheapen the thing by pretending it is. The promise is this, and I will lay it down plain so there is no mistaking it. That big plain woman standing still as a fence post at the front of that church while the whole county had its laugh. She was about to take that despised band of worthless brushgoats and that ruined thornbrush kingdom nobody wanted, the two things Cyrus Vane threw away laughing, and out of the pair of them she was going to build the finest mohair outfit the Chalk River Basin ever saw or ever would see. And before she was through, the very men who laughed the loudest in that church at her wedding were going to stand hat in hand in the dust of her sale yard and pay the price she named, the exact figure she set with her own mouth, because she was going to end up holding the paper on the lot of them. Now let me set it down proper and slow so you understand exactly what happened. But first you have got to see the gap. Hold on to the gap. The gap between what Cyrus Vane believed with his whole heart he was giving away that morning, and what it was, in truth, that he had just handed over. For here is the shape of what Vane thought he had done, and he was so sure of it that he would have laughed in your face if you had leaned across that pew and told him different. He was a wool man to the marrow, a grass and mutton man, a man who counted his wealth in blooded merino eways and the sweet bottom grass they grazed, and the great clip he shipped east every summer, and the price he alone could set on it, and a wool man looks at a brushgoat and sees vermin. He sees a scrub, a browse thief, a rough little half-wild nuisance not worth the powder it would take to shoot it, a thing that lives in the rocks and eats the leaves and breeds in the thicket and comes to nothing a Christian man could sell. That is the whole of what Cyrus Vane saw running loose up in the cedar breaks. A passel of worthless scrub goats, a joke of an inheritance, a thing a fool might chase around the bluffs for a year and come out the far side of poorer than he went in. And the breaks themselves he saw the very same way, as broke useless country, a choked maze of thornbrush and dry draw and bare rimrock with no grass a real animal could graze and no easy water a man could count on. Ground so worthless the tax roll had all but given up on it, the ruined. A place to lose an outfit in and never to build one. He believed, to the bottom of his certain soul, that he was giving away nothing at all. That was the whole cold beauty of it to him, the reason he could afford to be so grand and open-handed there in front of the entire county. He was paying off a bad debt and clearing a worthless hillside and shedding an embarrassment. And he was doing all of it with rocks and vermin, and looking like a king the while. But I am going to hold the true weight of it back from you just a little longer, the way she held it back from the whole Laughing County, because you cannot understand the size of Cyrus Vane's mistake until you understand the woman it was made against. And that is a story of its own, and I mean to tell it to you right. For now, tonight, in this church, you need only carry the one thing, the seed of the whole matter, that a man looked at a gift and saw garbage, and the woman he gave it to looked at the same gift, sight unseen, from the front rail of the church that was laughing her married, and did a quiet sum in her head that came out to a number Cyrus Vane would not have believed if an angel had written it in fire on the wall above the pulpit. He had made a mistake so large that the size of it would take years to come clear, and it would come clear slow, one figure at a time, in a book she had not yet started to keep. And by the time the last figure was written down in that book, it would read Cyrus Vane clean out of the country he thought he owned. Hold that. Set it in your teeth and hold it, because from here on it only gets better. Now her name was Elspeth Croft, and Kiln Springs had been laughing at her a full 10 years and more, in that low, steady, grinding way a small town laughs at a thing it decided about long ago and no longer bothers to look at straight. She was a big woman. That was the first of it, and as far as the town was ever concerned, very near the last of it, too. Broad through the shoulder and deep through the chest, and built heavy and strong and standing better than a head over most of the men who smirked at her across the square, a big-boned plain woman gone into her middle 30s, with thick reddened working hands and a wide, weathered, unpretty face, and a pair of steady gray eyes the color of creek ice under cloud. Her dark hair already gone ash at the temple and pinned up hard under a flat-brimmed man's hat she wore, without one thought in the world for how it looked on her. Too big to marry, the town had ruled when she was still a girl of 20-odd, and it had never once, in all the long years since, gone back to look at the ruling again. Too big and too plain and too strange, the wool stapler's daughter, old Angus Croft's odd girl, that great slab-handed silent creature who stood down at the wool shed on shearing day with her lips moving and no sound coming off them, murmuring to herself over other men's fleeces like a woman telling beads, the goat witch they had taken to calling her. Half in fun, and half in that uneasy way a hard country names a thing it cannot account for. That was the whole shape of Elspeth Croft in Kiln Springs, and the town wore that shape smooth as a saddle horn from 10 years and more of handling it, and not one soul in the whole of the county had ever once thought to ask what the big odd Croft woman was saying under her breath at the wool shed. Nor what a woman comes by such muttering, nor, God forbid, the thought should ever cross a Kiln Springs mind, what such muttering might one day turn out to be worth. But I am getting ahead of the promise, and I told you I would hold it back, and I will. Come back to the church. The little parson got through the words in a hurry. The way a man hurries through a thing he can feel the whole room finds funnier than he is easy with. And he mopped his neck, and he asked Rafe Doss did he take this woman to be his lawful wife, and Rafe said that he did. In a voice like gravel, going down a chute, still looking hard at the floor, a proud broke man doing the one and only thing a broke man is ever offered in this life, and hating thee. Laughter of the room a great deal more than he hated the doing of it. There was a scatter of low sound at that, somebody's smothered snort back in the pews, and the parson let it die and turned to the woman. And here the room went, in spite of itself, the smallest bit quiet, curious. The way people go quiet when the joke is about to do something they did not plan for, because in all the years of laughing at Elspeth Croft, precious few of them had ever heard the woman say a plain word out loud, and now they were fixing to hear her speak her vows and marry the joke they had built for her, and even a hard-laughing crowd will hush a breath to hear that. The parson asked her did she take this man to be her lawful husband. And Elspeth Croft lifted her head. She did not laugh, of course, and she did not weep, and she did not so much as color up while the church had its fun with her. She had stood the whole while big and still and plain at the rail, with her hard hands folded quiet in front of her apron, and her gray eyes level on the middle distance, unmoved as a stone in a creek that the water has been going around so long it has forgotten the stone was ever anything but part of the way the water runs. And now she lifted that wide, plain, weathered face and turned it, slow and deliberate the way a big woman turns, and she looked full at the lean, sunburned stranger they had tied her to. Looked at him straight and steady and unhurried. The exact considering way a body looks at an animal she means to keep, taking the whole of the man in at one long glance, and then again slower for whatever the first glance had missed. The good bone of him, the hard-used quiet of his hands, the way he stood a bad hour without breaking even while it shamed him. And something in the plain gray level of that look made the man beside her raise his own eyes up off the floor for the first time that whole morning and meet it. And then she said it. "I do," she said, clear and low and even, without one tremor in it, without one grain of the shame the whole room had come there to watch her wear. 2 plain words, and under the 2 plain words there was a thing, a weight, a steadiness, like the floor of the world, that stopped the last of the laughter dead in more than one throat, in that church, though not a living soul in the room could have told you afterward just what it was they had heard. Only that for the space of a breath the joke had not felt so much like a joke, and then the moment passed, and they let it go, and were glad to. Then it was done, and it had cost Cyrus Vane exactly nothing, and he rose up out of the front pew, well satisfied with his morning, and shook the hand of the man he had just married off, and told him with that same cheap, easy smile to go and enjoy his goats, and walked out of the church into the bright, hard, dry morning, a debt lighter and a hillside cleaner and a nuisance shed and the biggest man on. The Chalk River still, bigger for the charity of it, and the county filed out after him well pleased with the whole entertainment, and by noon the joke was all over Kiln Springs, men laughing about it in the wagon yard and over the store counter and along the corral rails, the neatness of it, the perfect open-handed economy of the thing. Old Vane marrying his bad debt off to his worst piece of ground and throwing in the crazy Croft woman to sweeten the jest, and every man who told it a little better than the last, the way a good joke fattens on the retelling. They laughed, and they went back to their own affairs, and they let it go out of their minds, the way a town lets go of a joke once it has finished with it and wrung it dry. But out on the North Road, in the long slant of that same afternoon, two people rode away from Kiln Springs that not one soul in that church had thought to watch go. A lean, silent, broke man on a borrowed horse, riding with his shoulders hunched under 10 years of debt now paid off in one morning's worth of humiliation, hating the ground ahead of him because he had been told all his life it was worth hating. And beside him, sitting a raw-boned mare, easy and straight-backed and wholly unhurried, a big, plain, quiet woman in a flat man's hat, riding up toward the rimrock and the broken brush country the whole county had just laughed at her for owning, her married name, not 2 hours old, and already meaning nothing at all to her that her own name and her father's eye had not meant a long time before. They did not speak. There was nothing yet that either one of them could have said that the other would have believed. The road bent north and east off the flat and began to climb, and the sweet grass benches of the Chalk River basin fell away behind them, and the sage gave over to greasewood and then to the first red broken ledges and the first dark, ragged walls of cedar, and the country stood up on end and grew thorns. And where the road bent and lifted for the last time toward the high ground, Elspeth Croft drew rein a moment and sat the tired mare still, and turned her head, and looked off north and east to where the land broke away and fell into the tumbled, shadowed maze of the cedar breaks, the ruined, purple and rust and old gold in the failing light, canyon mouth and thicketed draw, and the far dark line of the deep folds where she already knew, without being told, that water had to run. And she did not see waste ground there. She did not see a rock pile, and she did not see a hard winter and an empty belly, and she did not, above all, see a joke. She sat straight and heavy and quiet in the saddle, with her creek-ice eyes moving slow across the rimrock and the black cedar and the blind mouths of the draws, reading the country the way she had been taught from before she could walk to read a thing, taking the whole of it in and missing nothing, and her lips moved, barely, the way they always did. And the man beside her caught the least edge of the sound of it and did not understand one word, and would not for a good long while yet. What she was saying to herself on that rim in the last of the light, and why, and what her father had put behind those pale gray eyes that let her stand on a bench above the worst piece of ground in the county and do a sum that ended in an empire. That is the very next thing I am going to tell you, and I am going to tell it to you right, because it is the whole hinge of everything that comes after, and I will not have you thinking for 1 minute that any part of it was luck. But that is for the telling in its place. For now there is only this, that Cyrus Vane, riding home fat and satisfied to his good grass, believed down to his boots that he had given away a debt's worth of rocks and vermin to be rid of the bother of them, and that the big plain woman he gave them to had already, sitting her mare in the failing light on the lip of the ruint, seen something out there among the thorns and the scrub goats that the whole Laughing County could not have seen with 100 years to look. And the distance between those two seeings is the distance this whole story is going to travel, mile by hard-earned mile, until it comes out the far end at a place nobody in Kiln Springs that day would ever have believed. Then she gathered the mare and rode on, up toward the Rimrock and the wild band, and the broken thornbrush kingdom Cyrus Vane had deeded away with a laugh. And the man rode after her because he had nowhere else on earth to go, and the light went down gold, and then red, and then out ahead of the two of them, and behind them, down on the flat, the town of Kiln Springs told its good joke one more time in the lamplight, and banked its fires, and slept. Let me set it down proper and slow now, the way my own father set a thing down, so that you understand exactly what Cyrus Vane believed he was signing away that dry spring morning, and what it was he had truly handed over, for the two were not within 100 miles of being the same thing, and the whole of the story that follows lives in the gap between them. You have seen already the shape Kiln Springs had made of Elspeth Croft, worn smooth as a gatepost from 10 years of handling, until they no longer saw the woman under it at all, only the shape, too big to marry, too plain, too strange. Old Angus Croft's daughter, the woolman's odd girl, that great slab-handed silent creature who could put her hand into a matted filthy fleece off a half-wild brush goat and tell you to the ounce what it would scour out clean, and yet could not. So the joke ran: find one solitary man in the whole basin willing to stand up in a church beside her. But it was the other thing, the strange thing, that the town could never rightly place, and so had turned into the meat of the joke, the quicker to be shut of the trouble of it, that Elspeth Croft talked fibre under her breath. Not to a soul. To herself, low and steady, a murmuring undercurrent of a voice that people caught the ragged edges of and could make no sense of whatever, and what they caught were words that had no business, to their way of thinking, in any woman's mouth in that country. She would stand at the rail of the town wool shed on a shearing Saturday while some sheepman ran his clip across the sorting table, and her lips would move, and a body standing near enough, and there were fewer of those with every passing year, would hear her naming things off under her breath the way another woman might tell her beads. Long staple there, but it's tender, she would murmur, broke a third of the way up, that flock went hungry in February. Kemp threw the britch on that one. Cull him. Good handle, she would say, or no handle, quiet as breathing, of a fleece lying 40 feet off that she had done no more than glance at across the shed. Bright, she would say, that was the word they heard the most and understood the least, bright or dull, said soft to herself like a verdict handed down, and the men who heard it took it for witch talk and said so. And that is how a plain, hard-working spinster comes to be called the Goat Witch of Kiln Springs, and to have the name follow her to the store and to the well and clean into the church where they married her off for sport. She read a fleece the way another woman reads a face she has known all her life, the whole of it in one look, and then again slower for whatever the first look had let by. And it was not guessing, and it was not any gift the good Lord dropped on her sleeping. It was a trade. A deep, old, careful, patient trade, and she had it entire off her father, the way you take a thing off a man who means to leave you nothing else. For old Angus Croft had been a wool stapler in the old country before ever he took ship, a border man, Scots blooded and hard, out of that gray hungry hill country where the line runs between the two kingdoms, where a family's whole living hung on the clip off the hill, and a man learned the worth of fibre in his cradle or learned it never. A stapler is a grader and a sorter and a buyer of wool, a man who stands between the flock and the mill and lives or starves by knowing, better than the man who grew it and better than the man who spins it, exactly what a fleece is worth to the ounce and the grade, and Angus Croft had been a good one. And more than that, he had been a hill-goat man besides, one of that old vanishing breed that ran the long-haired fibre goats on the poor high ground the sheep would not thrive on, and knew the goat as he knew the sheep, which is to say better than most men know their own children. He crossed the water with a wife who did not last the crossing by many years, and a trunk of graded fleece samples and a fiber book bound in cracked black leather. And he fetched up at last in the hard limestone hill country above Kiln Springs, with nothing to his name but the trade in his 2 hands. And he had no son. He had Elspeth, his one great quiet girl, and he did not appear to want for a son once he had the measure of her. For he raised her to the fiber trade from the time she could walk in under a goat's belly without ducking her head, and he raised her to it the way another man raises a child up to the church, daily and gravely, and with the whole weight of his soul behind it, as though the saving of her depended on it, and his own along with hers. He taught her fleece first, always the fleece, for the fleece is the crop and the reason and the whole of the matter. He taught her to open a lock across her thumb and read the crimp in it, and the length of the staple, and the fineness of the fiber, and the way the light took it, taught her to feel the handle of it, the soft or the harsh of a thing under the working fingers, which no scale will ever weigh, and no eye alone will ever catch, taught her to find kemp, that dead brittle chalky hair that grows in among the good fiber and takes no dye and ruins a fleece for the fine trade. To find it and hate it the way you hate a rot. For kemp is the mark of the coarse old blood and the wild blood, and it breeds true and breeds back, and a stapler who cannot see it will be robbed his whole life long. He taught her the breech and the shoulder and the belly of a fleece, taught her that the shoulder carries the truest fiber and the breech the coarsest, taught her to skirt a fleece and to grate it and to throw the tender broke wool aside from the sound. Then he taught her the foot girl. Mind the foot. A goat is his feet in that rock country the same as any beast, and a fiber animal that goes lame in the pastern or splits a hoof or founders on soft rich ground will grow you no crop worth the shearing, no matter what he carries on his back. And last and hardest he taught her thrift, which was his word and his father's word before him for the whole doingness of an animal, the deep constitution of it, whether it held its flesh and got in kid and raised the kid, and came through a hard winter on poor brows still sound and still shearing. For a beast may carry a lovely fleece and a good foot, and still be a poor doer that dies on you the first dry year and leaves you nothing. And thrift is the thing that tells hollow from whole. Fleece, foot, and thrift. He drilled the 3 of them into her at the sorting table and at the shearing floor and out on the hill among the goats, until she could no more look at an animal and not run the 3 of them off in her head than she could look at the sun and not know it was daytime. And long after he was in the ground, she would still murmur them over a beast one behind the other, fleece and foot and thrift. The way you say a thing your father said, until it is no longer his voice saying it, but only yours. And over the top of the 3 of them, riding above them all, he had set the one word that was the crown of the whole trade, the word he said the way a preacher says grace, low and slow, and with his eyes half shut. Luster. In the goat. In the true fiber goat. The great thing was not the fineness alone, for many a beast grows fine hair, and it was not the length alone, for many grows it long. The great thing, the one thing, was luster, that deep silken living shine down the length of the lock, the way the light did not sit on the surface of the true fiber, but went down into it and came back up again changed. So a good lock of it in the sun looked lit from the inside like water over stone, like spun glass, like nothing else a poor man's animal ever grew. Luster is the soul of Mohair girl, he told her. And he told her it more times than she could count. Everything else in a fleece a cheat can fake, or a fool can breed toward, or a rich man can buy. You can wash dirt bright, and you can feed length onto a poor staple, and you can breed fineness up in a few short seasons if you have the silver to buy the blood. But luster you cannot fake, and you cannot wash it in, and you cannot buy it cheap twice. For it lives in the blood, and the blood only, ancient and particular, and either the animal has it down to the root of every fiber, or it has it not. And no man living can put it there who was not born into the beast 1,000 years gone. Luster was the one true thing. It was the thing the mill would pay for over every other thing when it came to lie blind on the sorting table under a buyer's honest hand, and it was the thing you read a beast for first and last, and Elspeth Croft could read it across a shed at 40 feet in poor light. And that, more than her size, and more than her muttering, was the true reason the town was afraid of her and called her a witch. Because she could see a thing plain that they could not see at all, and there is no surer road to being hated in a small place than that. Angus Croft died the way a stapler with too fine an eye and too soft a heart for the buying end of the trade will always die in a hard new country, which is to say broke. He had bought right his whole life and been paid wrong for it, had graded honest for men who sold dishonest, had known to the ounce the worth of 10,000 fleeces that made other men their money. And when the fever took him one cold spring, he left his daughter exactly 3 things, and not one thing more. He left her the eye, the trade itself, drilled so deep into her by then that it was the shape of her mind and could no more be taken from her than her own 2 hands. He left her the fiber book, that cracked black-bound ledger with his grated lock stitched to the pages and his hard slanting hand crawling the margins, 40 years of the trade pressed flat between 2 boards. And he left her the name, which by then was already halfway to a joke, the woolman's strange big girl, and would be the whole of a joke inside a year of his passing. Land he left her none, for he had none. Stock he left her none, for the last of his goats had gone to the last of his debts. A dowry he left her none, and a husband he could not leave her, and so a woman with no land and no stock and no money and a mocked name for her only inheritance went on through the years unmarried in a country that measured a woman by exactly those things she did not have, standing at other men's shearing sheds grading other men's clips for a day's poor wage, murmuring luster over fleeces that would never be hers, growing older and plainer and stranger in the town's eye until she was less a woman to them than a fixture. A thing to point out to a newcomer, that's the goat witch. Don't mind her, she talks to the wool. 10 years of it, and in all that time not one soul in Kiln Springs, not one ever once thought to ask themselves what it might mean to have living among them, poor and idle and laughed at, the single finest fiber eye in the whole of the basin, because a town does not see the treasure it has decided is a joke, and that blindness is the hinge the whole world turns on. And Cyrus Vane was about to lean his full weight upon it. For here's the gap, and I want you to stand a while in the middle of it and feel how wide it truly was. Cyrus Vane was a fine wool man and a mutton man, the biggest of both on the whole Chalk River, and he was a good one at what he knew, but what he knew was merino sheep and grass, and a man knows what his money is made of and is blind clean past the edges of it, and past the edges of Cyrus Vane's knowing lay everything that mattered here. When Cyrus Vane looked at a goat, he saw vermin. He saw a browsing, thieving thing that stripped the good grass country and barked the young trees and carried a coarse, hairy coat no honest wool buyer would name in the same breath as a merino fleece, an animal fit for a poor Mexican's cookpot and nothing above it. And when he looked at that band of half-wild brush goats running loose in the cedar brakes, he saw a nuisance he was glad to be shut of. A joke to hang on a joke. And when Cyrus Vane looked at the cedar brakes themselves, that great tumbled country of cedar brake and live oak thicket and shinnery and rock the county called the Ruint, he saw ruined ground, useless brush, 100 hard sections of thorn and stone that would not carry a wool sheep, nor fatten a beef, nor grow a blade of the grass that was the only green his eye had ever been taught to value. Waste country, throw-away country, the sort of ground a rich man deeds off free and clear for the pleasure of watching a fool try to live on it. But hear now what he had truly signed across that clerk's book, though it would take him years to learn it, and it would cost him everything he had by the time the lesson was through. He had handed her a band of goats carrying, gone hardy in secret in the brush, the ancient Anatolian blood, the true Angora, the fiber goat of the old high plains of Asia that grows the shining stuff called mohair, the very blood her father had run on the hills of the old country and had taught her to read down to the root. Somewhere back of that scorned brush band, some broke fancier or some bankrupt improver had turned a few head of good Angora blood loose or lost them into that country a long generation gone, and the breaks had done to them what no breeder with all the money in Texas could have done on purpose. It had culled them. Every soft beast, and every poor doer, and every bad foot among them had died in the first hard winters and the first dry years, and under the first lions, died, and left no get. So that what browsed up there now, town ugly and rough-coated and small, was 300 years of the hardest culling the Lord ever laid on an animal, the Angora blood burned down clean to only what could live, hard-footed, deep-bodied, thrifty past the belief of any pampered flock, and still, under the dust and the burrs and the sun-faded outer coat, still carrying down in the blood the one thing that cannot be culled out because it does not cost the animal anything to keep, the luster. And he had deeded her, along with them, the one stretch of God's country on the whole chalk river that had been shaped from the first morning of the world for exactly that animal and no other. Browse where he saw brush, a standing feast of cedar and oak and shinnery that a goat thrives on and grows fiber on while a sheep starves. Rock bluffs and box canyon walls for shelter where a kid can be dropped out of the killing wind, hidden seeps running cold in the deep draws where no man riding the rim would ever think to look for water, and hard stony ground underfoot, the very ruin of the place that would forge and keep a goat's foot sound as iron. Feed and shelter, and water, and footing, everything the animal needed, and every bit of it invisible to a grass man's eye, deeded away for a joke. She had never once set foot in the breaks. She did not need to. She sat her horse in the failing light on the north road, with her father's fiber book wrapped in oilcloth against her side, and she did the sum in her head the way he had taught her to do it, sight unseen, off nothing but what she knew, and the sum came out the same however many times she ran it. She had grading day glimpses of that band to reckon from, culls hauled through the Kiln Spring shed a time or two over the years and thrown aside as brush goat trash, and she had felt the hidden luster in that trash under her own fingers and said nothing, because it was not hers to say. And she had the buck. One time, one only, 3 or 4 autumns back, she had seen the foundation buck of that wild band come down off the rim at dusk to water at a stock tank on the edge of the ruin, a big, rough, dark old goat with the true Angora horn on him, the long spiraling out-turned horn of the ancient blood, and he had stood broadside to her in the last of the light, not 60 feet off. And she had opened a lock of him with her eyes the way her father taught her, down the shoulder where the truest fiber lies, and she had seen it. Kemp free. A clean, bright ringlet lock hanging in a true corkscrew curl, and the low sun going down into it and coming back up, changed, lit from the inside, water over stone. She had stood in her stirrups and said the one word out loud to no one, luster. And then the old buck had thrown his head and gone back up into the rocks and was gone, and she had ridden home and told not a living soul, and had carried the sight of that lock folded away inside her for 3 years, the way you carry a thing too valuable to spend. So she knew. Riding out that evening beside the broke and beaten man they had yoked her to for sport, with the whole town behind her laughing itself to sleep over the neatness of the joke, Elspeth Croft alone in all the basin knew the size of the thing, and the size of it was this, that Cyrus Vane in his open-handed contempt. Meaning to unload a nuisance and clear a bad debt, and be quit of the county's oldest joke all in one Christian-looking stroke that cost him nothing, had just handed a fiber woman with the finest eye in the basin the 2 halves of a fortune he could not so much as see, the true old blood and the true country to grow it on, and had made himself a mistake so large and so quiet that it would take years to come clear, years to unfold, years before the first hard dollar of it would land where he could feel it, but that when it came clear at last, it would come clear all the way to the bottom, and there would not be enough left of Cyrus Vane, when the last of it was reckoned, to laugh. They rode up the north road out of Kiln Springs in the last of that long dry light, the two of them married not 4 hours and hardly a dozen words spoken between them the whole way. Elspeth Croft sitting her old ewe-necked brown horse square and easy the way a big person sits who has been horseback her whole life, and Rafe Doss slouched loose, on the borrowed dun with the reins gone slack in his hands and his hat pulled down and his whole long body sagged over into that flat gray stoop a man takes on when the last thing he had left to lose has finally been settled and lost. The wagon track climbed and quit being a track and became a goat path, and the goat path climbed and quit being anything at all, and the mesquite flats fell away behind them, and the country stood up on end, and by the time the sun went down red and enormous behind the western rim they had come up into the mouth of the Cedar Breaks, the ground the whole county called the Ruint, and Rafe Doss reined in on the lip of the first big draw and looked out over the thing that had been deeded to him that morning as a wedding joke. And I want you to understand that what he saw very nearly took the heart clean out of him. He saw ruin. That is the plain word for it, and it is the word the county used, and I will not pretend to you that Rafe Doss was a fool for seeing it, because 100 cowmen and sheepmen had ridden to that same rim before him and seen the very same thing, and turned their horses and gone home. He saw 100 square miles of tumbled and broken and folded-up country, cut through and through with blind draws and box canyons that ran back into the rimrock and dead-ended against sheer rock, choked from the creek beds clear up the slopes with a wild dark tangle of thornbrush and cedar and live oak and shinnery and catclaw and cactus, a country that grew no grass a cow could use and held no open water a man could find and offered no single flat acre a plow could turn, a country that looked, in that failing red light, like the wreck of the world left over after the good land was made. And loose out in the middle of it, drifting like gray smoke through the brush a quarter-mile off and paying the two riders on the rim no more mind than they would have paid a pair of buzzards, was the other half of the joke, the band. The scrub goats, 40, 50, 60 head of small rough dun and brown and dirty white goats picking through the thorn, half wild and shy as deer, ragged and burr-hung and no bigger than a big dog. And Rafe Doss looked at them and looked at the country they starved in and let out a long breath through his nose and said the only thing there was in him to say. Well, he said, "There it is. He give us rock and thorn and a passel of scrub goats to starve on it, and he tore up my paper for the privilege, and the whole town still laughing." He did not even say it bitter. That was the worst of it, and I want you to hear it. He did not say it bitter. He said it flat and finished, the way you'd read off a thing already settled in a ledger and closed, because in Rafe Doss's reckoning the sum was done and the answer was ruin, and there was not one thing on that whole rim worth the naming. Now Elspeth Croft had said nothing this whole while. She had brought her old brown horse up alongside his and stopped it, and she was sitting at easy with her big reddened hands folded one over the other on the horn, and her flat man's hat was pushed back off her wide, plain, weathered face, and her steady gray eyes, the color of creek ice, were going over that country slow and careful from the rim, clear to the rimrock, and she was not seeing one blessed thing that Rafe Doss saw. That is the whole hinge of this story, right there on that rim in the last red light, and I mean to make you see it the way she saw it. Because the two of them were looking at the very same 100 square miles of the earth, and they were looking at two different worlds entire. Where Rafe Doss saw thorn, Elspeth Croft saw browse. She saw the cedar and the live oak and the shinnery and the catclaw not as a choking waste, but as a standing larder laid up green and deep, feed that carried its leaf through drought and through the killing cold long after the flatland grass had burned to dust, feed a cow could not use, and a fine wool sheep would not touch, but that a goat made for it, a goat bred 1,000 years for it, would walk into up to its brisket and grow fat and grow fiber on. Her father had told her once, in the old country burr she still heard in her own head when she read a thing true, that the Lord made 3 kinds of ground, and only ever made 1 kind of stock for each, and that the great grief and folly of men was forever trying to run the wrong beast on the wrong ground, and calling the ground ruined, when it was only their own eye that was ruined. And she had never in all her years seen the truth of it laid out plainer than it was laid out below her now. Where Rafe saw blind box draws that dead-ended into rock and were no earthly use to a horseman, Elspeth saw pens. Natural rock pens is what she saw, whole flocks worth of them, draws you could close off at the narrow mouth with a wagon load of brush and a day's work, and hold 100 head safe as in a stone barn with a rimrock for 3 walls, and every one of those sheer canyon walls that turned a cowman back she read as shelter. As a windbreak the Lord had raised up out of solid rock against the northers that would come howling down off the plains in the cold months and lay the fine-willed flocks out dead in their tracks in the open. Where Rafe saw no water and gave the country up for waterless the way every man before him had, Elspeth watched the band. She watched where the goats drifted and where they lingered, and where, as the light went, 3 or 4 of them cut away purposeful into the deep shadow of a side draw and did not come back, and she marked in her mind the dark wet line of green, the one true green, the cottonwood and willow green that does not lie, running up that draw where no green had any business being in a dry year, and she knew there was a seep in there running cold out of the rock, water the flatland eyes slid right over because it did not stand out in the open and shine, hidden water, the best kind, that the sun could not steal off the top of in August. And where Rafe saw hard, stony ground fit to break a plow and lame a horse, Elspeth Croft, who had been raised at her father's knee to the one trade she knew, saw the very thing above all others that she had come up that road hoping and half afraid to find. She saw ground that would keep a goat's foot sound, hard, dry, stony, rock-shattered ground that wore a hoof down clean and hard and tight and never once let it soften and rot and split the way the low wet ground rotted the feet of stock and brought on the limp and the canker and the ruin of a flock. Ground that would forge a hard foot on every kid born to it and cull the soft-footed dead before they ever grew to breed. God made ground for a goat. There was not, she thought, sitting her horse quiet in the dusk while her husband grieved beside her, a single square mile of it in the whole basin that Cyrus Vane could have handed her that she would rather have owned. And he had handed her 100, deeded free and clear, and torn up a man's debt to make her take it, and gone home to his supper well pleased. She did not say any of this to Rafe Doss. There would be a time for the saying of it, and this was not the time. A thing like that, told to a beaten man on a rim at dusk, only sounds like a woman's foolishness or worse, like a cruelty, and she had a great deal more sense than to spend it so. What she said was, "Let's get down off the skyline before we spook them, and watch a while." And they got down and led the horses back off the rim and hunkered in the brush in the last of the light, and the band, easy again with the 2 shapes gone off the sky, came drifting on down toward the creek bed to browse the cool of the evening. And this is where I have to slow the whole story down and ask you to look at those goats the way Elspeth Croft looked at them. Because Rafe Doss saw scrub, and the county saw vermin, and Cyrus Vane saw a joke. And Elspeth Croft, watching them come down through the thorn in the gray light not 60 yards off, saw 300 years of the hardest culling the Lord and the country between them had ever done to a living thing, and she felt her own heart come up hard against her ribs, because they were town ugly, and she granted that at a glance, and it did not trouble her one particle. By the measure of a fine wool man, by Cyrus Vane's measure, standing a fat merino sheep beside them square and bright and even and bred pretty for the show ring and the town's eye, these goats were nothing. They were small. They were rough. Their coats were weathered and burr-shot and sun-faded and hung every which way, and their legs were thin, and their faces were plain, and their horns went out crooked, and there was not one head in the whole band a stockman could have shown at a fair without he was laughed off the grounds. But Elspeth Croft had not been raised to look at the town's part of an animal. She had been raised, drilled, whipped near to it by a hard old loving Border Scots father to read a beast to the bone by three things and three things only, and the three things were fleece, foot, and thrift. And over the top of all three, like a roof over a house, stood the one word that was worth more than the rest of the dictionary put together, and that word was luster. And she sat there in the brush, and she read those scorned goats one by one against every word of it, and her breath went short. Thrift first, because thrift you can see across a canyon, and thrift does not lie. These were thrifty goats, deep-bodied under the ragged coat, wide sprung through the barrel, hard and rounded over the loin, doing well and carrying flesh, and slick with health in the tail end of a dry year, on a range every man in the county swore would starve them, which told her plainer than a bill of sale that here was a band that had been culled by hunger and drought and cold and varmint and rough country for 300 years, with never one soft season nor one bag of grain to carry a weak one through, until every goat left alive in it was a goat that could not be killed by the ruint, and that, she knew, is a thing no man's money can buy and no man's pen can breed in. Under 30 hard years, the country had done it for her, for free, and thrown it in with the joke. Foot next, and she watched them come down over the rock, sure and light and clean, and never a limp nor a stumble nor a favored leg in the whole band, hard little feet, worn tight and true on the stone. And she nodded to herself in the dark. And then fleece, and here is where the old blood showed through the dirt to an eye that could read it, because ragged and faded and full of the seeds and burrs of the brush as those coats were, hung along the flank and the breech and the shoulder of one goat after another, catching the last gray light and holding it, were locks. Long hanging locks, twisting down in true ringlets, spiraling and bright. Mohair is what it was, the true hair of the true Angora goat, gone hardy and hidden out here in the rimrock. And where the burrs and the sun had not got at it, Elspeth Croft could see the one thing her whole trade turned on, the thing her father had spent her girlhood teaching her hands and her eye to know, and had told her. Over and over, could be faked by no man and bought cheap twice by no man, she could see luster. That deep, live, silken, light holding shine down in the staple that is the soul of the fiber and the whole secret of its worth, and it was there, dulled and dirtied and hidden, but there, running like a buried vein of silver through a band of goats that a whole county had priced at nothing. And then the buck came down last. He came the way the head of any wild band comes, last and unhurried and watchful, letting the does and the kids go on ahead into the open, while he stood a moment in the mouth of the draw with his head up and read the wind. And Elspeth Croft laid her big hand flat on Rafe's arm to still him without a word, because she had seen this goat exactly one time before in her life, glimpsed across 200 yards of another man's brush a year gone by, and she had carried the memory of him ever since like a stone in her pocket, and here he was in the flesh, not 60 yards off. He was bigger than the does, but not big, deep and hard and thrifty like all his get, and he carried the true Angora horn, the great open spiral sweeping wide and back and out from the crown, the ancient horn, the horn off the old country and the old blood, the horn Elspeth had seen drawn in her father's fiber book that she carried wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag that very minute. And down his sides and over his shoulders and along his flanks, catching what light was left in the whole sky, hung the lock, long and heavy and clean, and twisting down in perfect bright ringlets clear past his knees, and even at 60 yards in the dusk Elspeth Croft could read it kemp free, free of that coarse, dead, brittle white hair. The kemp, the one flaw that beggars a fleece and cannot be bred out in a hurry, a clean, true, lustrous, silken lock, hung on a hard wild kemp, free buck standing sound, footed in the rock. And she understood, sitting there, that she was looking at the foundation of everything. The old blood, alive, culled by 300 years of the hardest country on the continent down to this one hard bright thing, and turned loose in the one country in the basin that could keep it, and handed to her, with the deed, as a joke. She let out her breath very slow, and she said, low, more to herself and to her dead father than to the man beside her, there you are. And the buck read the wind one more time, and found nothing in it to fear, and walked on down into the open to his doze, and the light went out of the sky. They made their first camp that night in the mouth of the draw, and Rafe Doss built up a little fire of dead cedar that burned hot and sweet, and threw a small ring of light against all that dark country, and he sat on his heels the far side of it, wrapped in his blanket, still gray, still gone somewhere flat, and finished behind the eyes. And Elspeth Croft sat down heavy on her bedroll near the flame, and took her saddlebag across her knees, and unwrapped the oilcloth, and she brought out the fiber book. It was her father's book, Angus Croft's book, thick and worn soft at the corners and swollen with damp and dried 100 times, the leather gone black with the grease of his old hands, and now the grease of hers. And inside it, in his cramped old country hand, were 40 years of fleece notes and grades and breeding sums and the little careful drawings of horn and lock and staple. And in the back of it, blank, waiting, were the empty ruled pages he had never lived to fill. She turned to the first blank page, and she smoothed it flat with the side of her big hand, and she took out the stub of a pencil. And by the light of that little cedar fire, up in the wreck of country a whole county had laughed her married onto that same morning, Elspeth Croft opened the ledger that was going to carry the whole of this story clear to its end, and started it. She did not write anything grand. She wrote the date at the top, the plain date of her wedding day, and under it she wrote the name of the country the way she meant to call it from that night forward. And then she began to enter the goats, one head at a time, the only way she knew, the way her father had drilled into her before she could read her letters, by fleece, by foot, and by thrift. She entered the buck first. She gave him a line to himself, and she wrote down what she had read on him across 60 yards of dusk, the horn and the depth and the hard foot and the clean kempt free lock and the luster. And against his line she made a small mark that was going to mean a great deal before this was over, though she did not know it yet, and neither did anybody else. Then she entered the does she had gotten a true look at, one line apiece, this one deep and lustrous, this one hard-footed and thrifty but coarse in the breech, this one bright but light-bodied, reading them out of her memory of the last light and setting each one down honest, the good with the plain. Because a ledger that flatters is a ledger that lies, and her father had beaten that into her, along with the rest. Rafe Doss watched her over the fire the way a man watches a thing he cannot make sense of. This big plain wife of a day writing goats into a book in the dark in the middle of 100 miles of nothing, and he did not say a word, and she did not explain herself, and the fire burned down, and that was the first page. In the morning she started to build, and what she built told Rafe Doss more than any speech could have, if he'd had the eye yet to read it, because he had ridden up that rim expecting, insofar as he expected anything, that a body who meant to make a living off wild stock in that country would do the one thing every man in that country did, which was build a trap, a horse trap, a big blind funnel of wing fence and brush, and a hidden corral to run the wild bands into at a dead gallop and slam the gate and fight them down. That was the country's whole idea of stock work, and it was Cyrus Vane's idea, and it was force. First to last, you overpowered the animal. You ran it and roped it and threw it and broke it against its own nature and called that husbandry. And Elspeth Croft did not build a trap. She walked the draws for 2 days first, with Rafe trailing after her, and she watched where the band already went, morning and evening, of its own free will, where it trailed down to browse, and where it drifted to water, and where it lay up in the heat, and she found the draw the goats already trailed through the most. A good draw with the cold seep running in the head of it, and hard ground and high rock walls on the 2 sides, and there, across the natural throat of it, where the goats already wanted to be, she set her first build. Not a trap. A fold. A browse fold and a kidding pen. A low strong wall of piled brush and dry laid stone thrown across the draw with the rock for its 2 ends built by hand, her big hands and rafes, hauling and lifting and fitting stone and packing thorn. A whole slow week of hard honest labor, and not one nail nor one board bought in town, and while they built it, she taught him. She taught him to wet his finger and read the wind before he ever came up a draw, so his scent went away from the band and not into it. Because a thing you would keep near you is a thing you must never once teach to fear you, she taught him to read the little trails pressed into the ground and know which way the band moved and when and why. She taught him to move slow and low and quartering and never straight at a goat, to work with the grain of the animal's own nature the way you work with the grain of a board, and not against it. Until the wild band, that would have blown clean out of the country at the first sight of a horse trap, watched two humans build a stone wall in their own home draw for a week and never took fright at it at all, because nothing about it hunted them. And on the seventh evening the thing happened that I have been carrying you toward, small as it was, because the whole empire turns on small things done right, and this was the first of them. The light went long and gold down the draw, and the band came drifting up off the brows the way it did every dusk, up toward the cold seep and the high rock and the shelter, up toward exactly the ground where the fold now stood and the goats. Finding the low brush and stone wall standing quiet across the throat of the draw where they had always come anyway, smelling nothing that hunted them and seeing nothing that had ever hurt them, walked in through the open mouth of it of their own free will, the does and the kids, and last of all the old buck with his true horn black against the gold sky, and settled down inside the finished fold to bed for the night as easy as if they had bedded there 100 years. Not run in, not fought in, not roped, nor thrown, nor broke. Walked in, because a woman who could read them had built the one thing they already wanted in the one place they already went. And Rafe Doss stood at the mouth of that draw in the gold light, with the stone dust dried on his hands, and watched a wild band that the whole county swore could not be held bed down of its own accord inside a wall he had raised with his own two hands, and something moved in that flat gray beaten face for the first time in a good while. He did not say much. He was never going to be a man who said much. But he pushed his hat back and he looked at the goats a long moment, and then he looked at his wife, and he said, low and grudging and half against his own will, "Well, it might could work." And Elspeth Croft, standing there big and plain and quiet in the last of the light, with her heart going harder than she would ever have let him see, only nodded once, and then she sat down on a stone by the finished wall, and took the fiber book out from inside her coat and opened it to the page she had started that first night, and by the last of the gold she wrote down. In her father's cramped hand, grown into her own, the date and the name of the draw and the count, every head, safe in the fold, the buck and the does and the kids all entered, and she closed the book, and that was the first page truly begun, and the first wall truly standing, and the very first small, quiet turn of the whole long wheel that was going to grind Cyrus Vane down to nothing before it. Was through. The word of it worked its way down out of the cedar breaks the slow crooked way that all news travels in a big country, passed from a line rider to a freighter to a swamper leaning on the end of a bar, and everywhere it went as the same joke it had been born as in the clapboard church at Kiln Springs, that Cyrus Vane had married his bad debt off to the goat witch, and staked the pair of them out on the ruint with a band of worthless brush goats to starve on, and wasn't that the neatest morning's work the Chalk River had seen in 20 years? They laughed at it in Kiln Springs, and they laughed at it in the shearing camps, and they laughed at it 40 miles south at the railhead, where the freight came up and the wool went down, and somewhere down in all that laughing a very old man heard it, and did not laugh at all, or rather laughed at a wholly different thing than the rest of them were laughing at, and set his face north. For there is a kind of joke that only sounds like a joke to the man who does not know the trade, and it can happen that the same words that split a barroom will fall on one old pair of ears in the corner like a bell rung in a country a man has not seen since he was young, and that is what happened when the tale of the goat witch and her scrub band came down at last to where Anselmo was. His name was Anselmo, and I will not pretend to you I ever learned the rest of it, because in that country nobody had, and it is likely he had let the rest of it go a long time back, the way a drifting man lets go of most things that weigh. He was old past the counting of it, a little dried dark knot of a man, gone the color and near the hardness of saddle leather, with a white brush of mustache and a pair of black eyes sunk deep and quick under a hat that had lost its shape before the war, and he had run goats his whole life. Angora goats and Spanish goats both, the mohair kind and the meat kind, on the dry ranges below the border and along both banks of the big river for 60 years and better, a chivero, a goatman, born to it under old Spanish blood the same way Elspeth Croft was born to fleece under her border Scots father, which is to say, he had the eye, the true one, the one that cannot be taught to a man who has not got the seed of it in him and cannot be kept from a man who has. He had followed the Angora up out of Mexico when the first of the good Turkish blood came into that country, and he had seen more mohair grow and be shorn and be ruined than any 10 men on the Chalk River had seen in their lives, and he was drifting north that spring with everything he owned tied behind a mouse-colored mule. An old man with no outfit and no people and nothing left to do but be curious, and the joke made him curious. Not the way it made the others laugh. It made him want to see, because he had run the old blood himself in brush like the breaks, and he knew a thing the whole Baroom did not know, which was that brush and hard rock and 100 hard winters do not ruin the old Angora goat. They make him, and an old man with nothing left in the world but the eye rode up the north road to see for himself what manner of fool would be given such a gift and be laughed at for taking it. He came up into the breaks on a bright hard morning when the browse was just breaking green, the little mule picking its way sure-footed up the draw where Elspeth had built her fold, and he sat that mule a long while at the head of the draw and said nothing, and only looked. And what he looked at was the fold. Now understand, he had not come to look at the goats first, though the goats were there, spread out through the live oak and the shinnery browsing easy and unpenned in the morning light. A lesser goatman would have run his eye straight to the stock, but Anselmo was not a lesser goatman, and he looked at the fold. He looked at the brush and dry stone browse fold set square across the draw the goats already trailed through, at the way it took the wind and shed the water and opened toward the morning sun, at the kidding pen tucked in under the bluff out of the norther, and he saw in one long look that whoever had laid up that stone had not been fighting the country nor fighting the goats, but reading both of them and working with the grain of the two. And the old black eyes came up off the fold and found the big plain woman standing quiet by the gate in her flat man's hat with her hands folded in front of her, and Anselmo laughed. He laughed the way a man laughs when he has ridden a long way on a poor joke and found something at the end of it he was not looking for. Then he climbed down off the mule, slow, all his 60 years of goats and the stiffness of it, and he walked over to her through the browsing band and the half-wild goats that would not let Rafe Doss inside 40 feet of them opened around the old man and closed behind him and paid him no more mind than they would have paid a cedar. And Elspeth Croft saw that too, and marked it, and said nothing. They talked. I would give a good deal to have stood at that gate and heard the whole of it. Two people who had the same rare eye meeting in a country that valued it in neither of them. But I have only the shape of it, which came down after. He asked her, part in his slow English and part in the Spanish she half had, what she meant to do with a band of brush scrub on a rock pile. And she told him. She did not tell it to him the way you tell a joke, and she did not tell it the way a woman defends herself. She told it the way one tradesman lays a thing out flat before another, and she said she meant to read them, and keep the sound ones off the old blood, and cull hard and cull true, and breed up real mohair off the foundation that was already running in that brush and had been culled 300 years by the wolf and the winter to exactly the iron she wanted, and not to ship scrub down to Vane's warehouse by the pound the way brush goats had always been shipped in that country, but to grow fiber, true lustrous Kemp-free fiber, and haul it out from under Vane's price and sell it for what it was. And then she offered him a wage. And here's the thing that I love best in the whole of it, and I want to make sure you have it, because it tells you more about Elspeth Croft than a page of her doings could. She had, at that hour, precisely nothing. She had a rock canyon the tax roll had given up on, a band of goats the whole county called vermin, a husband who owed his life to a torn-up note, and a ledger book with 3 pages written in it and not $1. And she stood at that gate and offered a 60-year goatman a wage, and the wage she offered was a joke. It was a joke laid down flat on top of the county's joke, so that the two of them together made a thing almost too big to laugh at. She offered him no money, because she had none, and she did not insult him by pretending she had. She offered him his keep and his coffee and a share of a Mohair outfit that did not exist, that the entire Chalk River Basin was at that moment laughing itself sick over. A cut of the increase of a band of worthless goats on ruined ground, paid in kids that had not been born to does, that had not been culled off blood, no buyer in the country would yet touch. That was the wage, a share in nothing, offered by a woman married off for sport to a drifting old man with a mule. And Anselmo, who had heard the joke in the barroom and ridden all this way to laugh at it, opened his mouth to laugh at this too, and then he did not. Because he had heard, threaded all the way through her plain, flat telling of it, the words breed up and off the old blood and kemp free and luster, and an old chivero knows those words the way a priest knows the words of the Mass, and he understood of a sudden that the woman was not dreaming, and was not simple, and was not soft, but was the one thing he had never once expected to find at the top of that draw, which was right. The laugh went out of the deep-sunk eyes. He looked at her a long moment, and he looked past her at the buck standing off on a ledge with the sun in his ringlets, the true buck, the Angora horn on him and the perfect lock, and the old man took off the shapeless hat, which in 60 years he had likely not done for many, and he said he would stay. He had come to see a pair of fools. He stayed for the blood. Now the gather. You who are watching this in your warm rooms tonight, I want you to sit with the gather a moment, because the drawing rooms of Kiln Springs never learned the first true thing about it, and it is the thing that separates the people who did this work from the people who laughed at it. It is a small, pretty phrase bringing in the band, and it sounds like nothing, and it is murder. Those goats were half wild and wholly wary, and they had run that Broken Bluff country loose for years, and to bring them off the high benches and the blind box draws and the bramble slopes down into the fold was to go up on your own feet into ground that would kill a careless man and never be sorry. There were bluffs in the breaks that dropped 40 feet onto rock with a screen of brush hiding the lip, and there were shinnery slopes so thick a man went through them on his belly, and there were draws that ran flash in a hard rain with no more warning than a smell on the wind, and the goats knew every one of these and used them. And a wild doe with a kid up in that bramble will take a line no man on earth can hold and dare him to follow. Elspeth Croft did not chase them. That was the whole of her method, and it was Anselmo's too, and it was why the two of them took to each other's ways inside a week. They did not chase. They read the trails the band already ran, and they read the wind so their scent never turned the leaders, and they worked the slow, patient wings of it. An old man and a big woman, and by now a lean, quiet husband, learning fast, moving the band a little and letting it settle, and moving it a little more. 3 days on a piece of work another outfit would have tried to blast through in an afternoon, and scattered to the four winds doing it. Rafe Doss went off a ledge in the second week and caught brush, and hung there over a bad drop till the two of them worked him up out of it with a doubled rope, and he never told it in town, and neither did they, and that is what I mean about the drawing rooms. They had their joke about the goat witch and her broomtails. They never once knew what the taking of them cost, up in the rock, in the cold mornings, where nobody was watching, and there was no one to laugh. And then, brought at last into the wing of the fold, one band held loose in the big browse pen under the bluff, came the reading and the culling, and this is the heart of the chapter and the heart of the woman, so I will slow down and let you watch it." She culled them one head at a time. Anselmo cut them to her. Easy. A single goat eased up out of the mill of the band and along the stone wing to where she stood by the gate with the ledger open on a plank and the pencil in her cold-reddened fingers, and she read each one to the bone by the triad her father had drilled into her before she could read her letters: fleece, foot, and thrift, and over the three of them the one word, luster, that cannot be faked nor bought cheap twice. She went into the fleece with her hands, and she parted it down to the skin, and she looked for the enemy first, the way you always look for the enemy first, and the enemy was Kemp. The coarse, dead, chalky hair that will not take the dye and will not spin true and runs through a bad fleece like sin through a bad man and ruins the whole of it. A goat hung with Kemp went to the scrub pile, though every other thing about her was fair. A goat coarse in the fiber, thick and harsh where the mohair should have run fine, went to the scrub pile. A goat hairy in the thigh, kempy and slick down the britch, where the true blood carried its lock clean to the hock, went to the scrub pile. Because the britch tells on a goat, and Angus Croft's daughter knew it. Then the foot, always the foot, and a goat splay-footed or soft or gone lame and favoring on that hard ground, went to the scrub pile no matter how her fleece read, because a goat is her feet and nothing else in brush country, and a woman who forgets it goes broke. And then the thing there is no clean word for: thrift, the doing, the deep old will in an animal to hold her flesh and raise her kid and thrive where a poor doer starves. A thin, ribby poor doing doe went to the scrub pile, though her fleece were silk, because she would not throw a kid worth keeping and would break your heart trying. And what came through all of that, what she kept, was the foundation. The deep-bodied, lustrous Kemp free, does that carried the true ringlet lock bright as spun glass off hard sound feet. Does that had thrived on nothing but brush and rock their whole lives and asked no man for a thing, and over the lot of them the true buck, kept back and penned separate, the Angora horn and the perfect lock, the ancient Anatolian blood alive and running in the cedar brakes. Every keeper she wrote into the book, not a tally mark, mind, but written, each one by fleece and by foot and by thrift and by the luster on her, a line of her own that was the beginning of that doe's whole history, and the scrub she wrote too, in their own column, called, and the reason set down beside each: Kemp, coarse, britch, foot, poor doer, so that the ledger from its first real working pages was two things at once, a record and a judgment, and there was no arguing with it because there was no vanity in it. And it was in the middle of that work that Anselmo sealed himself to her for good, and it happened in a way I have always thought was the truest handshake two people of that kind could give. She was reading down a knot of does eased along the wing, working toward a rough, dark little nanny half hidden behind the others. Town ugly. Nothing to look at, and the old man was leaning on the stone at the far end of the pen where he could not have had his hands in a single fleece, and before Elspeth's eye had so much as reached the dark doe, before her hand ever went into that fleece, Anselmo straightened up off the wall and pointed with his chin, the way an old goatman points, and said one word. Foundation. He named her. He read that rough, dark, unpromising doe clear across a milling pen for exactly the deep, lustrous, Kemp-free thing Elspeth's hands were 3 goats away from proving her to be. Called the best doe in the band before the woman with the book had touched her. And Elspeth Croft looked up from her ledger and looked at the old man a long moment, and then she put her hand into the dark doe's fleece and parted it to the skin and found the true bright Kemp-free lock exactly where he had said it would be. And she wrote the doe into the book, and beside the line she wrote his name. That was the hiring, not the wage, which was a joke, the naming of that doe. 2 people who could read the one thing the whole country was blind to, knowing each other by it across a goat pen. From that hour the old man was hers, and hers to the end of it, and there is not one page of what came after that he is not somewhere behind. And I want you to set her way of doing beside the country's way, because the gap between the two is the whole reason a woman with nothing beat men with everything. And it is not luck, and it is not magic, and I will not have you thinking it was. The country ran brush goats the way you run vermin you are half ashamed to own, turned them loose to shift for themselves in the worst brush a man had, never handled, never sheltered, gathered once a year in a wild rank sweat, and thrown down and shorn in a hurry by the pound by men who hated the doing of it. Hacked and second cut and nicked and hurried, the staple butchered, the fiber full of grass and burr and dung and dust, because no one had penned them clean the night before, the shorn goats then turned straight back out naked into whatever weather came to take their chances, a good half of the clip ruined in the shearing, and the rest of it Kempy scrubbed to begin with. And small wonder the mills paid Brush Hair the bottom dollar, and Vane's warehouse graded it all as one low thing. Now set Elspeth Croft against that. She handled her goats gentle and daily until the wild went out of the kept ones, and they came to her hand and to the fold of their own accord. She sheltered them, browse and bluff, and the fold against the norther, because a chilled wet goat robs her own fleece to keep her body warm, and the luster goes out of the fiber and never fully comes back, and luster was the whole of what she was growing. And when the season came round, and it was time to take that first small clip off the foundation does, she did not throw them down and hack at them. She penned them dry and clean the night before, so no rain nor dew was in the fleece. She sheared them slow and careful and close and even, long clean blows that took the staple off whole and unbroken, and never doubled back to make the short second cuts that foul a clip. She skirted away the dungy britch and the stained edges, and kept the good fiber to itself. And she rolled and tied each fleece by hand and read it one more time as it came off, and she kept them apart by grade so that the best lay with the best. Where the country made scrub worse in the taking of it, she took her fiber off in a way that lost the animal not one thing the animal had grown. And what came off those few good does, penned and sheltered and gently shorn, was not brush hair at all. It was mohair. True, long-stapled, kemp-free, lustrous mohair, the real article, so far above what the Chalk River called goat that a blind man could have told the two apart by the feel between his fingers. And now the receipt, which is where I will leave you, because a woman may talk blood and luster all she likes, and it is only talk until the first dollar comes home and settles the argument, and Elspeth Croft knew that better than anyone. She had this first small clip, a few sacks, no great thing, the first fruit of one season off her foundation does, and the whole established way of that country. The only way there was to haul your fiber down to Cyrus Vane's warehouse in Kiln Springs, where Vane graded it, and Vane weighed it, and Vane paid what Vane said it was worth, and took his cut coming and going, because Vane held the warehouse and the freight and the price, and there was no other door. And Elspeth Croft did not go through that door. She refused Vane's warehouse entirely, refused it flat, the first soul in the basin ever to do it, and instead she loaded her few good sacks in the wagon, and she made the culls pay their own way out the other end. The scrub she had thrown off, the kempy coarse poor doing goats, she did not waste. She turned them to honest account as brush-clearing stock and meat stock. Goats that would eat a fenced-out man's thornbrush down to bare dirt and fatten doing it, and there were dry country men glad to buy exactly that, so that the culls that were supposed to be worthless cleared their own keep and a little over. And then she took the good clip, and she hauled it the long, hard way around Vane altogether, out of the basin to a mohair buyer who bought fiber straight. A commission man off the rail who knew the real article when it came across his table and did not have to be told, and she laid her few sacks in front of him and let the fiber make her whole argument for her. The staple, the luster, the clean of it, no kemp, no scrub. And when he named a price, she did not take his first figure the way a grateful woman is supposed to take a great man's charity. She named her own. She named an honored figure, a fiber price, a true mohair price such as nobody in the Chalk River Basin had ever once been paid for anything that walked on four legs and browsed, and the buyer looked at what was in the sacks and paid it. and Elspeth Croft drove home the long way with the first real dollars of it folded away. And that night she opened the book and turned past the culls and the keepers to a fresh page and wrote them in. The first money, the date and the weight and the grade and the figure. The first real numbers in the ledger that was going to carry the whole story to its end. And 40 miles off, in Kiln Springs, where the joke had been born, the very first thread of a different sound started up. Low and puzzled, and not yet believed. A whisper going quiet from the store counter to the corral rail that the goat witch on the Ruint had hauled a clip out from under Cyrus Vane and been paid a fiber price for it. And that maybe, just maybe, the joke had not been quite so funny as the whole county had laughed. The whisper had barely gotten up on its legs in Kiln Springs, a thing men said sideways over the store counter, that the Croft woman had hauled a sack of goat hair clear past Vane's warehouse and got real money for it out from under the old man's price, which could not be true, and which nobody could quite call a lie either, when Elspeth Croft, up in the Cedar Breaks, the county called the Ruint, stood one still morning in the early part of that summer and read a killing drought coming off the land, months before any man on the Chalk River so much as thought to button his coat. And I want you to understand how she knew it. Because it was not a guess and it was not a gift, and I will not have you thinking it was luck. Any more than the reading of a fleece was luck. She knew it the way her father had taught her to know the weather of a country, which was not by looking up at the sky, but by looking at what the ground had already decided to do about the sky, for the land, old Angus Croft used to tell her, is honester than any cloud, and it starts getting ready a long while before it lets on. She read it in the brush first, in the way the live oak and the shinnery had set their leaves early and set them hard and small and turned edge onto the light, hoarding, the way a plant hoards that has taken a message down through its roots the man on top of the ground has not gotten yet. She read it in the seeps, in the box draws where the hidden water came out cold at the foot of the rock. Read them going quiet, and low and slow, the green fringe pulling back around them a finger's width at a time, the deep, cold veins of the breaks drawing down into themselves against a call for water that had not come yet, but was coming. And she read it in the sky, in the high-shut iron color of it that would not rain and would not clear, the color of a lid, and in the wind that came dry off the south week on week and never once smelled of water. And she stood there in the brush with her plain, broad face lifted and her creek ice eyes going slow across the country, and her lips moved. And she said one word under her breath, low and even and certain, and the word was dry. She did not tell the town, because the town would have laughed, and she did not tell Rafe yet, because Rafe would not have believed her, and a man who cannot see a thing is not moved by being told it, only by the thing itself, done and laid on the ground, where the eye cannot deny it. She went instead, and did the only argument worth making, which was the work. Through the long hot weeks of that summer, while the Chalk River barons ran their fine wool sheep and their cattle out fat and easy, on the great open flats of grass the whole county was so proud of, and let them graze it down close, and never thought a thought past the next shearing, Elspeth Croft made ready in the breaks for a hard thing coming that not one of those men could see. She cut browse and cured it and stacked it dry back under the rims out of the weather, cedar and live oak boughs laid up like a squirrel lays up mast, browse reserve against the day the standing brush might not be enough. She and Rafe raised the dry stone shelter walls higher across the mouths of the wintering draws, the blind box canyons where the band already trailed of its own accord, walling them tighter against wind and building the deep-bedded catch pens where a doe could kid out of the weather. She went easy on the range where a careless man goes hard, moving the band draw to draw so no one stretch of browse got hit twice, saving the good sheltered south, facing benches back untouched the way a poor woman saves the one good candle, keeping her wintering ground held in reserve while the whole basin below her ate its own pasture to the roots. And old Anselmo, the drifting chivero who had come up out of the south to laugh at the fools and stayed to run her cruise. Anselmo, who had run Angora and Spanish goats on ranges below the border for 60 years and had buried more dry years than most men in that country had lived. Anselmo confirmed it for her in the old way, which was his own way and not her book's way, but came out at the same true place. He watched the wild things. He showed her the deer come down off the high divide a full month too soon, and browsing anxious and close in country they did not usually work, he showed her the birds gone from a seep that had never failed in his memory. He cut a live oak twig with his old knife and split it, and looked at the wood and said nothing for a while, and then said, quiet, in his soft border Spanish that she had learned enough of by then to follow, that the tree was afraid. Viene la seca, he said. The dry is coming. And he looked at the browse she had already cured and stacked, and at the shelter walls already raised, and at the wintering ground she had already held back. And the old man understood that she had known it before he rode in to tell her. And he did not say anything about that either, but something settled in his face. And he took off his hat and wiped his head and put it back on and went to help her stack more browse. Then the great dry fell on the Chalk River basin, and it fell the way real drought falls, not all at once like a blow, but slow and total like a tide going out and never coming back. The high iron sky held and would not break. The last of the spring grass cured on the stem and then went past cured to dead, and then the dead grass grayed and shattered and blew. And by the deep of that summer the great envied flats of the Chalk River, the fat open grazing ground the whole county measured its wealth by and had laughed at the ruin for not being, the flats went to dust. They went to bare cracked caliche, and a little gray stubble a hungry animal could not get its lips around, and the tanks the barons had scraped in the draws went to green scum, and then to cracked mud, and then to nothing. And the shallow surface water that grass country runs on dried up and blew away with the grass. And here's the whole hard heart of it. The thing that had been sitting inside this story from the morning the church laughed, come round at last to be paid, grass-dependent stock has nothing on this earth when the grass fails. A fine-wool sheep is a grass animal, and a beef cow is a grass animal, made to walk a flat with its head down, and eat what grows soft at its feet. And when that soft thing dies, there is no more in the animal's whole nature, nor the whole country's furniture, to save it. The barons hauled cottonseed cake at a killing price, and it was not enough. They drove stock 100 miles to grass that turned out to be as dry as the grass they left. And then they simply began to lose them, in the terrible arithmetic of a real drought. First the old and the weak, and then the whole flocks. The fine wool sheep and the good cattle that the county had been so proud of, dying not dramatic but dull and patient, and by the hundreds, going down on their knees on the bare flats and not getting up. Dying strung out in windrows along the fence lines where they had drifted with the dry wind at their tails, hunting a green thing that was not. There, dying, and I want you to hold on to this, on the very grass the whole county had envied, killed by the exact wealth they had measured themselves by, because the grass was all they had, and the grass was gone. And up in the ruin the goats got fat. That is the reversal, and I am going to drive it all the way home, because the county had it coming, and so, I think, do you, after sitting through the laughing. While the flats went to iron and the fine wool flocks died in windrows on them, Elspeth Croft's despised scrub Angora goats walked out into the same killing drought and thrived in it, because a goat is not a grass animal at all. A goat is a browse animal, made from the ground up to reach and to climb and to strip the leaf off a woody plant, and the thorn brush and the cedar and the live oak and the shinnery of the cedar brakes, the very brush that had ruined that country in a cattleman's eye. The choking, worthless scrub that was the whole reason the range was called the ruint and thrown away for a joke. That brush has its water down deep in a taproot a grass drought cannot reach, and it stayed green. It stayed green and leafed and alive through the whole of the great dry, standing feet a foot off the ground and higher, and her goats browsed it fat. They browsed it fat and slick and deep-bodied, with the good lustrous fleece coming on them thick. And as they browsed, they did the other thing. The thing that turned the last of the joke clean inside out, they cleared it. They opened the choked draws and thinned the cedar and knocked back the thorn brush and let the old grass roots breathe under it, doing for nothing, out of their own hungry nature, the very brush clearing that ruined men paid crews to do, improving the range that was supposed to be worthless by the simple act of living well on it. And the seeps held. The deep, cold, hidden veins of water in the box draws that Elspeth had read going quiet a season before anyone else felt a thing, they drew down, and they held cold and steady at the foot of the rock through the whole drought, while the barren, scraped tanks blew away as dust, because that water never ran on the surface where the sun could take it. It ran deep in the rock the way the brush ran its roots deep in the country God had shaped for goats and no one else had wanted. The breaks that could not keep a cow alive in a wet year kept every head Elspeth Croft owned alive and fat through the worst dry the Chalk River ever saw. Cyrus Vane had thrown her the one piece of ground in the whole basin that did not care whether it rained, and the fleece came on through all of it, that is the part a fiber woman marks, and no one else would think to. For a drought that starves an animal starves the fleece it grows and breaks the staple and burns the shine out of it, but her goats were not starving, they were browsing fat, and so the mohair kept coming down long and bright, and kept free off well-fed backs, the luster holding in it the way the seeps held in the rock, while every scrap of wool the barons managed to save off their dying sheep came up short and dry and broken, the drought written into the fiber itself for any buyer to see. Then, because the country was not done, and neither was the year, a savage norther came down on the back of the drought. This is the other blade of it, the one the old hands feared worse than the dry, for a hard blue norther on the tail of a killing drought is the thing that empties a range for good. It came in off the north in the black end of that winter with no more warning than a wall of dirty cloud and a drop in the light, and the temperature fell like a dropped stone 40 degrees in an hour and then more, a screaming dry wind out of the north with sleet in the teeth of it, and it fell on stock already drawn down thin and weak from a year with no feed in it, and it fell hardest, in the cruelest stroke of the whole terrible year, on the fine wool sheep, because the barons, caught between the drought and their creditors, had gone ahead and sheared, had taken the one clip they could still sell off the backs of their starving flocks to raise a little cash against the ruin, and a freshly shorn fine wool sheep in a killing norther is a dead sheep. It has no fleece left to turn the wind, and no fat left under its hide to burn against the cold, and it dies fast, and it dies easy, and they died by the thousand that night on the Chalk River, the shorn flocks piling into the fence corners and freezing where they piled, so that men rode out in the gray still cold of the morning after and found their whole year's wealth stacked dead and stiff along. The north wire, finished, the drought and the norther between them having taken everything the grass country had. And on that same killing night, up in the ruint, Elspeth Croft was kidding her goats, for it was the deep of the year, and her does were coming in, the true bucks first get among them, the whole promise of the foundation herd carried in the bodies of does about to drop their kids into the worst night of the worst year, and a newborn kid is a wet, tiny, half-made thing that will chill and die in minutes in cold like that if no one is there for it. And she was there for it. She had brought her heavy does down into the deep-bedded catch-pens back under the rims out of the wind days before, reading the norther coming the same way she read everything. And now, through the whole black, roaring length of that night, she and Rafe Doss worked the kidding by lantern light with the wind screaming over the rimrock above them, and they did not lose them. Where a hard kid hung, and the doe strained and could not, Elspeth stripped back her sleeve and went in with her big, careful hand and turned the kid and drew it, patient, in the freezing dark. The way her father had drawn hard lambs and hard kids in the old country, saving the doe and the kid both. And where a kid came chilled and limp and near gone, its wet coat freezing on it faster than the doe could lick it dry, Elspeth Croft did the thing the flat-range men would never have thought to do because they had already ridden in and left their stock to die. She opened her own coat, and she put the freezing kid inside it against her own body, against the warm of her own chest, and she held it there and breathed on it and worked its little cold legs with her thumb, warming a dying thing back to life inside her own clothes, while the norther that was killing whole flocks a day's ride south of her killed nothing at all of hers. Rafe worked the far end of the pen with a second lantern and a sack, doing the same, clumsy at first and then not clumsy, warming chilled kids inside his own coat because she had shown him how, and I want you to see the two of them there because it is the exact center of this whole story. A big plain woman and a lean, quiet, broke man, married for a joke by a town that was at that hour losing everything it had laughed with, up on the ground nobody wanted. On their knees in the frozen straw all night long, pulling live kids into the world and warming the cold ones back from the edge inside their own coats, saving small lives one at a time that every proud man on the Chalk River would have left in the dark for dead. And it was in that long ordeal, somewhere in the black hours of that night and the gray hard days on either side of it, that the last of the joke burned finally and wholly out of Rafe Doss. I cannot tell you the hour of it, because there was no hour of it. It was not a thing that happened. It was a thing that finished happening. The way a fever breaks so slow, you only know afterward that it is gone. He had come up into the ruin a year before a ruined man, riding away from the worst morning of his life, certain in the front of his mind that he had been tied to a madwoman and deeded a rock pile and would starve on both, and grudging every step of the way, even as the work turned out truer than his doubt. And now he had stood a whole year in the plain daily proof of her, had hauled the mohair she read out of scrub, had watched the drought she foretold come down and kill the men who laughed while it left them fat, had knelt beside her all one killing night saving lives with his own hands that he had not known a man could save. And somewhere in all of that the bitterness simply had no more ground to stand on, and it went. And what came up quiet in the place of it was the small, slow thing this story never once let him name. It came the way everything real between them came, always a half step behind the work and never out in front of it, never spoken. It was in the way he began to hand her the good lantern without being asked and take the poor one for himself. It was in the way he came to stand a half step back and to the side of her when the two of them looked at the band, the way a man stands by a thing he has decided to be part of. It was in 100 small unsaid handings over across that hard winter, and neither of them ever put a word to it, because they were not word people, they were work people, and the love that grew up between Elspeth Croft and Rafe Doss grew like the brush in the brakes, slow and deep-rooted and quiet and tougher than anything on the fat flats below. And it did not need saying, and so it never got said. And it held. When the norther blew itself out, and the country counted its dead, the count that came up out of the ruin was the one that got told for years afterward, up and down the Chalk River, in the exact low sideways voice men use for a thing they cannot explain and cannot quite make themselves disbelieve. Not one grown head lost. In the worst year the basin ever had, the year the barons dragged their fine wool flocks dead out of the fence corners by the thousand and the great grass outfits went to the bank on their knees. The crazy Croft woman up on the ruined brush that Cyrus Vane had thrown away for a wedding jest had not lost one single grown goat. Not one, to the drought, nor to the norther, nor to the whole terrible turning year. And more than that, the thing that put the iron into the story and would not let it die, a clean kid crop dropped and saved and standing, and the true bucks first get among them already carrying, plain to any eye that knew to look, the perfect Kemp free lock, the true lustrous ringlet of the old Anatolian blood come down whole into the new generation, luster-bred true off the foundation and standing on its own 4 hard little feet in the spring grass of the one country that had come through the year green. That count sealed old Anselmo for good. Whatever half of him had still been staying on for the show of it went all the way over that spring, and he took off his hat to her the once, gravely, and never after called it anything but her outfit. That count turned the whisper in Kiln Springs serious at last, took it out of the joking mouth and put it into the low careful one, until men who had laughed at her wedding began instead to say her name flat and think before they said it. It brought the first riders out of pure hard curiosity up the long road into the ruin that no one had ever troubled to ride before. To sit their horses at her fences and look at the fat goats and the green browse and the held seeps and the clean kid crop, and to ride back down again quiet. And it curdled Cyrus Vane's contempt down in Kiln Springs into something a good deal meaner than contempt, because Cyrus Vane was not a stupid man, and he could read a ledger even if he could not read a fleece, and he understood before anyone that a joke which comes through the worst year on record, having lost nothing while it costs the man who made it everything, is a joke no longer, and never would be one again. A joke that pays is not a joke. It is a rival, and a rival was the one thing on the whole Chalk River that Cyrus Vane had never in his life let stand. And the morning old Cyrus Vane understood that plain. The morning the drought count and the kidding count both came off the cedar brakes and ran the length of Kiln Springs, not one grown head lost, and a clean crop of kids on the ground carrying the foundation buck's true lock, while his own fine Will bands lay rotting in windrows along the flats. That was the morning the laughing stopped for good and the war began. And I want you to understand exactly what Cyrus Vane was, and exactly where his power lay, before I show you how he brought it down on the head of a plain woman up in the brush, because a man may be beaten 100 ways in a country, and it matters a great deal which way he holds the whip. Vane was not merely the biggest fine wool and mutton baron on the Chalk River, though he was that. The size of his flocks and the reach of his deeded grass were the least of what he held. What Cyrus Vane held, and had held, for 20 years so quiet and so complete that half the basin had forgotten it was a thing a man could hold rather than a fact of nature like the weather, was the road to market itself. He owned the district wool warehouse at the railhead, the one great tin-roofed barn where every clip in the basin was weighed and stored and graded and sold. And no fiber left the Chalk River country for the mills of the East except it passed across Cyrus Vane's scales and under Cyrus Vane's hand. He held the freight and commission on it besides, so that a man who wanted his wool hauled the long, dry road to the cars, hauled it on Vane's wagons at Vane's figure, and paid Vane a cut of the sale for the privilege of Vane's selling it. And under the two of those he held the third thing, the keystone, the standing mill supply contract with the great combing mills back east that said the mills bought their district fiber through him and him alone and at the price he set. Do you see what that made him? It made him the price. When Cyrus Vane said that fiber in the Chalk River basin was worth so much a pound and not 1 cent more, then it was worth exactly that from the head of the river to the railhead, because there was no other scale to weigh it on, and no other road to carry it out, and no other buyer at the far end of the road. And a man with a clip to sell sold it to Vane at Vane's figure, or watched it rot in his own shed. That was the throne he sat, quieter than a gun, and a great deal harder to break. And it was the reason the deeding of a scrub goat band to the Croft woman had been such a fine and costless joke, because everyone in that church had known, without troubling to say it, that whatever she scratched out of those rocks she would have to bring down to Vane's warehouse and sell into Vane's hand at whatever chicken feed price Vane cared to name for wild brush hair. And so she could never truly win, no matter what she caught, because Cyrus Vane owned the only door out of the country. So he opened his campaign the way a man opens a campaign when he owns the only door, which is by shutting it. He did not ride up into the cedar brakes and shake his fist. Men of Vane's kind do not shake fists, they close accounts. He simply let it be known, in the flat, quiet way that word travels in a warehouse town, that the district scales at the railhead were not open to the Croft clip. There was no room in the barn, the warehouseman said, mild as milk. When Rafe Doss brought the first proper load of it down, the season's storage was let already, and a man ought to have spoken for space in the spring. The commission wagons were all engaged and could not be spared for a haul out of the brush. And the sale itself when Rafe pressed it. The sale was a thing arranged between the warehouse and the mill buyers by a schedule Cyrus Vane kept in his own head, and there was, it seemed, no day on that schedule for wild goat hair out of the ruint. Not this season, and not likely the next. It was all done soft, and all done legal, and there was not one word in any of it a man could take to law, and it shut the market in Elspeth Croft's face as complete as a slammed door, because a clip a body cannot weigh, and cannot haul, and cannot sell is not a crop at all. It is a barnful of trouble drawing mice, and behind the shutting came the slander, which was the cleverer weapon, and the one Vane plainly relished, for it cost him nothing, and it fell on the one ground where he believed himself unbeatable, the ground of what the fiber was. Breaks mohair, the word went, up and down the basin and down the wire to the millmen east, is not mohair at all. It is kemp, scrub hair, brush hair, coarse, dead, wild blood fiber shot all through with the white brittle kemp that no comb can card and no dye will take. The hair of half-wild goats bred by nothing but the wolf in a canyon full of thorn, and no mill in the country will touch a bale of it at any price, and the woman who is fool enough to raise it is fool enough to think it worth the raising. That was the killing stroke, or Vane meant it so, because a fiber's whole name in the trade is its reputation, and a lie about a clip travels faster and lodges deeper than the truth of it ever can, and once the millmen east had it in their heads that Chalk River goat hair was Kempy scrub, the finest lock God ever grew would grate out worthless sight unseen on the strength of where it came from. And when the shutting and the slander did not break her, for Elspeth Croft only listened to the report of them with her plain face still and her gray eyes level, and said nothing, and went on working her goats, Cyrus Vane reached back 20 years into the ground itself, and woke a dead thing to do what the living could not. He sent his lawyers digging in the old territorial records at the seat, and they came up with it, a survey 20 years dead and never proved. An old contested line run before either the Crofts or the Doss debt were ever heard of on the Chalk River, and by the reading Vane's men gave it, that old dead line ran the boundary of the Cedar Breaks grant a full half-mile north of where the county had always set it, north far enough, and this was the whole art of the thing. This was why he woke it, to throw the hidden seep springs at the canyon heads outside Elspeth's deed and back onto open range a man might file on. For here is a thing the drawing rooms never learn, and the hill people know in their bones. In a dry country, the deed to the grass is nothing, and the deed to the water is everything. The water is the deed under the deed. And a man who holds the springs holds the range around them whether his name is on the grass or not, because stock that cannot drink cannot stay. Vane had looked at the Cedar Breaks the first day as ruined, useless brush, and seen nothing in it worth a lawyer's hour. But the drought had taught him what Elspeth had known from the start, that those cold, hidden seeps that ran on when the flats went to iron were the one true treasure of that country. And now he meant to take them with a dead survey and a live filing, and leave her a deed to 100 square miles of waterless rock, which is to say, leave her exactly the joke he had always believed he was giving. Then the paper war spilled over into the other kind, the way it always does when a big man grows certain he is being cheated of what he never owned, and the range war escalation came down on the Breaks in the dark. A band of Elspeth's does was found scattered 1 gray morning miles up the wrong canyon, driven off their bed ground in the night by riders who left their sign plain enough and their faces home in bed. A prime buck was found shot and left where he dropped, not butchered, not taken, only killed, which is a message and not a theft. A seep at the head of the near canyon was found fouled, a dead thing thrown down into the water that a family and a flock both drank. And writing on the back of all of it came the word that was meant to make the rest of it lawful, the oldest and ugliest word in the open-range country, the maverick claim, that stock running unmarked and unbranded on the range is no man's property in the eye of the law and free for any man to gather and burn his own iron into, and that the Croft goats, running half wild and unmarked through the brush the way she ran them, were mavericks every hair of them, and any rider in the basin might lawfully throw a loop on them and drive them home and call them his. It was a lie with a true edge on it, which is the most dangerous kind, because it was in fact the custom of that country that unmarked stock was up for grabs, and Elspeth had gone a year and better without putting an iron to a single head, running them loose and reading them, and keeping her tally only in the book, and so by the letter of the open-range custom Cyrus Vane had found a way to make the wholesale theft of her whole foundation flock look like nothing worse than a neighbor gathering strays. Now here is where you take the true measure of the woman, and it is not the measure the dime novels would give you. Rafe Doss came in off the fouled spring, white around the mouth, with a rifle in his hands, and old Anselmo said not one word, but went and got his own, and stood waiting by the corral in the gray light with his flat old eyes gone to slits. And the two of them between them had killed men before over less, and would have ridden the rim that very night and made Cyrus Vane pay in the only coin a range war is ever finally paid in, and every man who has ever heard this story has felt the pull of wanting her to turn them loose. She would not. She stood in the cold, with her big reddened hands quiet at her sides, and she told them no, flat and low and without one tremor in it, the same voice she had said "I do" in, and she told them the thing her father had drilled into her past forgetting, that you never fight a man on the ground he has chosen, and the gun was the one ground Cyrus Vane could not lose on, because Vane had money to hire more guns than they had lives to spend, and the law in his pocket besides, and a hanged goat woman would suit his purposes fully as well as a starved one. A range war she could only lose. So she would not give him a range war. She would answer him, she said, and she took down off its peg not a rifle, but the branding iron, and she opened on the table not a box of shells, but the book, and she went to war with the two things her father had left her, which were a mark and a ledger. And I will tell you plainly, they were the deadlier weapons, and Cyrus Vane never once saw them coming. She marked the goats, every head of them, does and bucks and the new kids and the old foundation buck himself, run through the pen and held and marked, and the mark she chose was the whole of her answer, for she did not burn some ordinary letter into their hide where any running iron artist could work it over into another man's brand. She had them notched and marked to a pattern she took off the animals themselves, off the true blood's own perfect lock, the deep even kemp-free ringlet curl that the foundation buck grew and passed down, and that no scrub goat in the basin could grow to save its life. A mark she called, and a country came to call. The curl, it went into the book beside every head, a drawing of it in her own hand, and it went on to every animal, and the beauty of it, the pure hard cunning of it, was that it could not be faked and it could not be worked over, because it was not only a mark burned on the outside, but a thing the animal grew on the inside, the lock itself. So that a stolen croft goat carried the proof of its own theft in the hair on its back that no thief could counterfeit, and no running iron could alter. And that killed the maverick claim stone, dead in the pen, in an afternoon, without a shot, because a marked animal is no maverick, the whole of the maverick lie hung on the stock being unmarked. And she had answered it not with an argument, but with a fact burned into hide and grown into fleece, and any man who threw a loop on a curl-marked goat now was not gathering a stray, he was a goat thief plain. And Cyrus Vane's free for any man had turned in a single afternoon into the hanging kind of crime it truly was. Then she sat down with the book, and she went to work on the survey, and here again she fought him with paper and not powder. She got herself a certified copy of that same dead 20-year survey out of the territorial office, and old Anselmo, who had run goats on both sides of that country for 60 years, walked the ground with her seep by seep, and she copied the old lines and the water and the years of open, honest, unbroken use, her use and the wild band's use before her, into a water and use case laid down flat and true in the ledger, building the deed under the deed the slow, patient way, a line at a time, so that whenever Vane's dead survey should finally stand up in a courtroom there would be waiting for it a living record of. possession and use that no lawyer's dust could blow away. She did not win the water back in a day. But she made it a fight he would have to win in the open, on the record, in the light, which is the one place a thing done 20 years in the dark can never bear to be dragged. And then, having shut every door he could reach, she went over his head to the one door he did not own. And this was the master stroke, and I want you to sit with how simple it was and how completely it undid him. Cyrus Vane held the warehouse and the freight and the mill supply contract, and by them he held the price of fiber in the whole basin. But he held the price of the fiber that went through his hands, and Elspeth Croft had understood from the very first that the way to beat a man who owns the road is not to fight him for the road, but to find the country he does not know is there. Vane's contract was a wool contract, his mills were combing mills that bought the district's fine wool, and his whole grip was built on wool, and mohair, true mohair, the lustrous Kemp-free fiber off the Angora goat, was not wool at all. It was another fiber entire, judged in another trade, bought by other men at other mills for the shining worsted goods that wool could never make. Vane could shut his wool warehouse in her face till doomsday, and it did not signify. Because she had never had 1 pound of business there, she raised a fiber his monopoly did not touch and could not price. And all his shutting of the wool road only proved he did not understand what she was hauling down it. So she loaded her whole clip, the true Kemp-free mohair, off 2 years of hard culling and careful shearing, sacked clean and honest, and she hauled it the long way round Vane's warehouse entirely, straight to the railhead, straight to a man named Osgood. Miska Osgood. The mohair mill buyer come out from the east to the cars, the one court in that whole country that Cyrus Vane could not buy, bully, or shut. Because Osgood did not answer to the Chalk River, Osgood answered to the sorting table. And you must understand what the sorting table was, because it was the whole of Elspeth Croft's faith made into a thing you could stand at and see. A mohair buyer like Osgood did not care 1 snap where a clip came from, or whose enemy raised it, or what the basin whispered. He judged fiber blind, on the table, by the hand and the eye, the way her father had judged it in the old country and taught her to judge it before she could read, by luster, that overword above all the others, the deep living light in a true lock that no scrub hair ever had and no man could fake nor buy cheap twice, by staple, the length and the strength of the fiber, by fineness, and by clean scoured yield. The honest weight of good fiber left when the grease and the dirt were washed away. He laid a lock on the table under the north light, and he read it exactly the way she read a goat. And the report of the land did not enter into it by so much as a feather's weight. So when Osgood pulled a lock of the brake's clip across the back of his hand in the cold light off the rail, and the deep even ringlet broke open and threw the light the way spring water throws it, Kemp free from the skin to the tip, long in the staple and sound, and scouring out clean and bright to a yield he had to weigh twice to believe. The whole tin roof of Cyrus Vane's 20-year lie came off in that one silence, because there is no arguing with a lock of true mohair laid beside a lock of Kempy brush hair. The eye that cannot tell horses can tell that. The difference is the difference between light and lead, and it is lying there on the table for a child to see. He graded the district's other goat hair, the real brush scrub, the Kempy wild stuff the basin actually did grow off its unbred goats, and it graded low and true Kempy scrub just as the word said, and then he graded hers against it, and hers graded top of everything that came off the Chalk River that season. A foundation blood mohair, the equal of any the mill bought anywhere. And Cyrus Vane's own great clip, his pride, his fine wool that priced the basin? Osgood did not even weigh it against her, because it was not the same fiber, it was wool, and it had no more to do with the top mohair price than the mutton did. The man who had set himself up as the one measure of fiber on the Chalk River could not so much as enter the contest she had just won, because he had never in his life understood there were 2 fibers in his own country, and she had built her whole life on the one he threw away. Osgood bought her clip. He bought the whole of it on the spot, over Vane's price at the mill's own true figure for top mohair, which was a number that near stopped Rafe Doss's heart to hear said out loud at the cars, and then he did the thing that turned a good season into the crack in the dam. He leaned on the sacks and asked her, plain, how much of this she could raise, and told her he would take every pound of it she ever grew and count himself lucky that the mills back east were starving for exactly this, and there was no bottom under the want of it. And that was the wet line down the face of the dam, the first dark seep through the great wall Cyrus Vane had stood 20 years. Because the moment there was one true buyer paying one true price for one true fiber out from under the warehouse was no longer the only door. And the price Vane set was no longer the price. And every man in the basin who had a scrub goat and a grudge began that very week to do the sum. It did not break all at once. A thing that old and that heavy never breaks all at once. But the shamefaced buyers began to find their way up her road, the long, hard road into the ruin that the whole county had laughed at her for taking, coming quiet and one at a time to see the goats that grew the hair the mill was starving for. And the men who had laughed loudest at the church door came hat in hand to the pen at the cedar breaks, and asked, careful, after breeding stock and after her figure, and the curl, the mark she had burned on in the dark of the range war to save her flock from thieves, became in that one season the thing it stayed ever after, not a defense any longer, but a warrant. The one mark in the whole Chalk River country that meant true fiber. Mohair, a mill, would grade top sight unseen because it wore the curl, the mark taken off the perfect lock of a scorned buck in a canyon nobody wanted, worth more now than Cyrus Vane's whole warehouse and every lie stored in it. Now a man like Cyrus Vane, when he feels the floor first give a little under his boots, does not step back off the bad board and count what sound ground is left him and build careful and low on that. A man like Cyrus Vane comes down harder on the very plank that is breaking, because the whole long, comfortable run of his life has taught him one lesson, and only the one, that the cure for any trouble a man meets is simply more of the same thing that made him big in the first place. He had held the Chalk River Basin the better part of 30 years with lawyers and freight and the standing contract and the loud, sure voice of a man who had never in his life been made to wait for an answer. And so when the mohair price cracked open under him like a dam, showing its first dark, wet seam down the face of it, and the shamefaced buyers began to find their slow way up the north road to a stone house in the lee of the cedar breaks, Cyrus Vane reached for exactly the tools that were sinking him and bore down on them with the whole of his weight. He sent for more lawyers. He put the 20-year dead survey back on the clerk's desk a second time, refiled and reworded, to take another run at the springs that were the deed under her deed, and paid a Fort Worth land firm a retainer that would have wintered a good flock to do it. He hired talk the way another man hires hands, mouths at the wool warehouse, and mouths at the railhead, and mouths at the courthouse steps, all of them saying the same paid thing, that Brake's mohair was Kempy wild blood scrub no honest mill would touch twice, and the Croft woman's grades were a fluke and a fraud and a 9 days' wonder that would break with the next clip. And he sent wire. Lord, the wire that man sent that year, a blizzard of it, to commission houses in Boston and buyers in Philadelphia and mill agents in 3 states. Yellow flimsies going out off the Kiln Springs Key by the dozen and the score, every one of them $1, and every $1 of them going out to fight a thing that no lawyer could depose, and no survey could unwind, and no hired mouth could talk down, and no wire on earth could reach, because the thing Cyrus Vane had set himself to fight was no longer a woman at all. It had stopped being a woman somewhere back in that first sorting room at the railhead when Osgood cut into her clip blind on the table and paid her the mill's own top figure over Vane's price. It had become a number. It had become a fiber price, honest and blind and past all argument. And a man cannot outspend a price. He can only spend himself into it. And that is precisely and exactly what Cyrus Vane now set about doing. Dollar by proud dollar, every one of them running downhill toward her like water finds the low ground, so that the harder he fought, the faster he fed her, and he never once saw it. Because a man who has never in his life had to read a ledger to the bone does not think to start when the reading would cost him everything he owns. And she read him. That is the part the drawing rooms never credit, and the part I want you to sit with a moment, because while Cyrus Vane was pouring out lawyers and wire against a price, Elspeth Croft was sitting of an evening at the plank table in the stone house with her father's fiber book open under the lamp, and she had started a new page in the back of it, and at the head of that page in her plain, hard hand she had written the one word Vane. The Vane page Rafe Doss took to calling it, and he did not much like to look at it, for there was something in a woman keeping so cool and so patient an account of a man's ruin that put a chill on the back of even a loyal neck. But she kept it, and she kept it the same honest way she kept every other page in that book, by reading the true figures off the world and setting down not one mark that was not so. She read his debt off the rail buyer, who talked as all rail buyers talk, of who was shipping and who was not, and whose drafts were being carried over and whose were not. She read it off the public record at the clerk's, which is open to any soul with the patience to sit and copy it, the liens and the filings and the recorded paper that a big man scatters behind him like chaff and never thinks a plain woman will trouble to gather. She read the carried drafts, the ones the commission house rolled forward a quarter and then another quarter, because Vane had no clip coming in behind them to clear them. She read the second mortgage, the killing one, the one he had signed against the home range itself in the black bottom of the Great Dry, when the drought had burned his fine wool flocks to bone and windrow on the very grass the county had envied him. And he had needed cash to hold on, and had put the crown itself up to get it, believing, as such men always believe, that next year would come in fat and clear it. And she posted it, line by patient line, quarter by quarter, the interest running against him in the one column, and his empty warehouse earning him nothing in the other, until the Vane page in the back of that book was as true and as detailed an account of the man's sinking as existed anywhere on this earth. Truer than his own bank kept, truer than his own lawyers knew, and by the light of it Elspeth Croft came to know Cyrus Vane the way she knew a fleece in her two hands. To the bone, past all the bluster and the broadcloth, down to the one plain figure of exactly how far behind the man was, and exactly how little it would take, and exactly when. And then it turned, the way a great heavy thing turns, not all at once, but on its hinges, and there were two of them, and she had oiled the both of them for years without ever once raising her voice. The first hinge was the contract, the great mill supply contract, the standing district agreement to deliver the Basin's clip to Osgood's mill at the railhead, the very paper that had let Cyrus Vane name the fiber price of the whole Chalk River for a generation, because the man who holds the contract holds the door, and every other grower in the basin had to come through him to sell. That contract came up for its renewal in the fall of the fourth year, the way it came up every third fall, and it had gone to Cyrus Vane every third fall since before Elspeth Croft ever rode up the North Road, as regular and as unquestioned as the frost. Only this fall Cyrus Vane had no clip to put under it. The drought had killed his flocks, and he had not built them back, could not build them back, for his cash was all run out to lawyers and wire, and what fleece he could still scrape off the district's grass-run sheep was fine wool, which is a fine thing in its place, and its place was not this, because the mill that mattered now bought mohair, wanted mohair, was hungry clear to the back teeth for the long, lustrous, Kemp-free mohair that only one outfit in the Basin raised. And she had it. She had thousands of pounds of it in her own warehouse under her own mark, graded and skirted and honest, more of it and better of it than the whole rest of the district could muster between them. So when the contract came up, she did not go to war for it, and she did not go loud for it. She bid it the way she did everything, close and clean and honest. The mill's own figure and a fair freight and an honest grower's margin and not one dishonest dime laid on top, a bid so square that Osgood, who had spent his life watching men try to squeeze him, read it twice for the trick in it, and found there was none. And she took it. She took the district contract clean out of Cyrus Vane's hands into her own, and when she did, the floor went out from under the man entire, Because the contract had never truly been about the fleece, it had been the door, and the door was hers now, and every grower on the Chalk River who wanted to sell to the mill would come through Elspeth Croft's warehouse from that day, at the price Elspeth Croft named, and Cyrus Vane stood outside the door he had held for 30 years with a fistful of lawyers' bills and a range full of dead grass, and nothing at all, to sell. And the second hinge was waiting for him on the courthouse steps, and it needed no push from her at all, for she had never once had to lift a hand against the man. She had only had to be the ground he fell onto. With the contract gone, he had no earthly way to clear the carried drafts, and the commission house, which carries a big man exactly as long as it smells money behind him and not 1/4 longer, quit carrying, and called. And the bank that held the second mortgage, the killing one on the home range, read the same wind the commission house read, and it called too, on the same gray morning. The way crows come all at once to the same fallen thing, and it all rolled together and came down at once, the way a hillside long undercut by water comes down at last in a single hour after standing so many years you thought it never would. They cried the crown at a sheriff's sale on the courthouse steps at Kiln Springs in the cold bright end of that 4th year. The whole of it, the home range under the good rimrock, the wool warehouse, the freight barn, the sale yard where Vane had cried the basin stock for a generation, and the brand itself, the crown iron, the mark that had meant the biggest man on the Chalk River since before there was much of a Chalk River to be big on. And Elspeth Croft came to town to buy it. She did not send a lawyer, and she did not send Rafe, and she did not send Anselmo. She came herself, plain, in the flat-brimmed man's hat she had worn to be laughed at in 11 years before, and wore now without one thought for how it looked, because it had never once been about how it looked, and she stood at the back of the little knot of men on the cold steps, big and quiet and gray at the temples, and she let the auctioneer work down through the silence to the place where nobody else in that county had the money or the nerve to say another word, and then she bid. Once she named her figure one time, flat and clear and not a dollar over what the thing was worth, and there was no second bid against it, because there was no second person in the whole basin who could have made one, and the auctioneer, who had cried stock for Cyrus Vane at that very yard, looked at her a long moment and knocked it down to her. And the home range, and the warehouse, and the sale yard, and the crown brand itself all passed in that one quiet word into the hands of the woman Cyrus Vane had married off 11 years before to clear a brush hand's debt and unload a stretch of country he called the Ruint. And she paid for the whole of it, every rod and every board, and the iron, too, with money made off the band of worthless brush goats he had thrown into the jest, laughing to sweeten it. Now let me set the reckoning down for you plain and in hard figures, because this is a story about a book that does not lie, and it owes you the sum written out. Cyrus Vane had come into that dry country worth, by the loose talk of it, better than $200,000 in land and stock and paper, the biggest fortune on the Chalk River. He went out of it owing more than he could cover by the price of the very range he stood on, which is the plainest definition of a broke man there is. The second mortgage alone had run him past 40,000, and the drought had eaten the flocks that were to have cleared it, and the lawyers, and the wire, and the refiled survey, and the hired mouths had eaten better than 20,000 more. All of it spent, every dollar of it, fighting a fiber price that his own dead grass had made and her live goats had claimed, and when the sheriff's hammer came down, and the accounts were all totted and the paper all called, Cyrus Vane was, to the dollar, worth less than nothing at all, and Elspeth Croft knew the figure to the dollar because it was written in the back of her book on the Vane page, in her own hand before ever the bank knew it. And he went away. There was no scene made and no words had, for the country does not work that way, and neither did she. He simply was not the biggest man on the Chalk River any longer, and then he was not a man of the Chalk River at all, and I am told he walked down the wide main street of Kiln Springs the last time small. Gone gray and stooped and somehow shorter than the broadcloth had ever let him look, past the warehouse that was hers now, and the sale yard that was hers now, and the town that had laughed with him in the front pew 11 years before watched him go and said very little. Because there is not a great deal a town can find to say when it watches the truth catch all the way up to a man at last. He had been priced. That is the whole of it. The man who had named the price of everything and everybody in that basin for 30 years was in the end himself named a price. By the one court that cannot be talked to, and cannot be bought, and cannot be hurried, the only ledger that never in this world tells a lie. And the price it set on Cyrus Vane when the reading was all done was nothing. And it read him out of the country he thought he owned as clean as she had once read a coarse Kempe cull off the good blood, and for the same reason, because he did not carry the true thing and never had. And now let me carry you up onto the rim and let you look, because the years run on past a man's ruin the way they run on past everything. And there is a thing you can see from the high rock above the cedar breaks a dozen years on that no soul standing in that laughing church could have been made to believe with a gun to his head. Look down. That broken canyon country under the rim rock that the whole county called the Ruint and left to the coyotes and the wind. That 100-square-mile waste of thorn and cedar and blind box draw that a fine wool man could not hold nor sell nor give away, it is white with goats. Thousands of them, Angora goats in their long, lustrous ringlet fleeces, strung out browsing across the green brush that never dies, up every draw and along every bluff, and down to every cold, hidden seep. A kingdom of them, read into being out of bare rock by a woman's 2 eyes and her dead father's craft in her hands. The water is hers, patented in her name, the springs Vane's dead survey tried twice to steal. The warehouse is hers, and the sale yard is hers, and the freight is hers, and the mill contract is hers, the whole door of the basin swinging on her hinge. And there is one plain number I will leave with you out of all of it, one figure off the honest books, and it is this. The mark of Elspeth Croft ships more mohair off the Cedar Breaks in a single season now than the whole assessed wealth of the entire Chalk River district amounted to on the morning the church laughed her married more true fiber out of the ground they called worthless. In one clip, than the county was worth entire the day it decided she was worth nothing. That is the sum. That is where the account comes out when it is kept honest and kept long. And every dollar of it was read off rock and browse, and water and the old true blood, and a goat's back, and not one figure was set down in that book that was not so. And the mark itself, that ships it. You should know the shape of the mark, for it is the whole story cut into iron. It is not a crown, and it is not a ladder, and it is not any proud thing a man dreams up to make himself feel large. It is the curl, a single true ringlet, the exact perfect Kemp-free lock she read off the foundation buck's shoulder that first dusk in the breaks when Rafe Doss could see nothing but a scrub band they would starve on. The one lustrous curl of true Angora fiber that cannot be faked nor bought cheap twice. Taken off the best of the old blood and burned into the hide of every head that came after so. That no man could ever work it over into his own, and it had killed the maverick claim in the pen years before, and it means, up and down the Chalk River to this day, the one thing it has always meant, which is true fiber and an honest weight, and a woman who will not lie to you about either. And the old buck himself, the foundation buck, the ancient blood alive in the rock that she read true on a single glimpse 11 years and a lifetime ago. He lived long, and he died old, gray clean to the muzzle, and in his last easy years he walked loose at her side about the home place like a dog, unpenned and unbothered, having sired the whole white kingdom below the rim. And when she went down to look at the goats of an evening, the old gray buck went with her, a half-step off her hip, and the crews took their hats off to the both of them. The crews are Anselmo's, old Anselmo, the drifting Chivero who rode up out of pure curiosity 60 years into a goat man's life to see the 2 fools Vane had married off with a scrub band for a joke, and stopped laughing when she told him her true plan, and stayed old Anselmo ran her cruise to the end of his days and never once wanted a better place, and his grandsons ride the breaks under the curl now, gathering her thousands the patient way he taught them, working with the nature of the animal and the lay of the country the way she had shown him she already knew that first season. And there are children on the Chalk River today whose grandfathers rode for Elspeth Croft and who cannot rightly imagine the country any other way. And in the low stone house in the lee of the wind there is a shelf, and on the shelf there is a row of ledgers, her father's book, and then hers behind it, a dozen years and more of them. Kidding, and clip, and cull, and sail, set down foot by foot, and fleece by fleece, and dollar by honest dollar, locked in their case against the weather, and I will tell you that that shelf of plain locked books is the truest deed to that country that was ever written, truer than anything on file at the clerk's. Because the clerk's paper only says who holds the ground, and the ledgers say why. And the why is that she read it right, when not one other soul alive could see past the word worthless to the thing itself. And Rafe Doss. He stood a half-step back. I will not lie to you about the shape of it, because the whole point of this story from the church door on has been that it does not lie about the shape of things. The small, slow measure of love that came up between them across those hard years was a real thing and a true thing. Arrived late and quiet in a killing winter over a chilled kid warmed back to life inside her own coat, and it warmed the both of them the rest of the way, but it never divided the empire, and never softened it, and never once asked to. And Rafe Doss would have been the first and the hardest to tell you so. He worked her sail gate. He was a good hand and a respected one, counted hers up and down the Chalk River, and he stood a half-step back and a half-step to the side of Elspeth Croft at the rail and the ring and the head of the cruise, near enough to be counted hers, and far enough that no man ever once mistook whose country it was. And he had made his peace with that, and more than his peace, and was glad of the shade. The love had arrived, the small, honest measure of it, and it was enough. And it was more than the church that laughed them married would ever have believed a woman could keep and a man could bear. But the empire kept the crown. It had always been hers. And the men who laughed. You have been waiting for them, and you have every right to them. For I promised them to you in that church, and a promise is a promise. They came to her. Not with any grand humbling, for the country does not work that way. They came the slow, ordinary way, one hard season at a time, the way a debt comes due. The sheepmen whose grass-run flocks the droughts kept killing came up the north road to buy sound stock and browse, broke ground to build back on. And the price they paid was the price Elspeth Croft named over her own scales in her own yard, and they paid it. The young men who had dared each other to laugh at the goat witch grew into hard-pressed men who needed wages and rode up to ask Anselmo for work. And the ones who could learn got it, and drew her wage and gathered her thousands under the curl and were glad of the place. And the very sons of the men who had settled 2 debts with one cruel joke in a front pew bought their fiber and their breeding stock under the curl, because there was no better to be had in that whole country, and never would be again, and they took the price she named, and touched their hats, and said ma'am. And most of them never once put together that they were living out to the letter the low. Plain word a big quiet woman had spoken under her breath in a laughing church before ever a dollar of it began. So there it is, the shape of the thing entire, followed clear down to where it empties out. A whole county looked at a big, plain, odd woman and a band of scorned brush goats and 100 square miles of canyon nobody could hold. And it saw 3 worthless things and laughed to see them married together in one open-handed stroke, and it went home and told the joke and slept. But the woman kept a truer set of books than the county did, and so did the ground under her feet and the blood in those goats' backs. And in the end there is no lie a town can tell that the ledger will not correct, given years enough and a hand honest enough to keep it. The worthless band was the truest wealth in the basin. The worthless ground was the only kingdom worth the holding. The worthless woman read the both of them right when not one soul on the Chalk River could see past the word to the thing, and she wrote the whole account out true, kid by kid and lock by lock, and hard dollar by hard dollar, until the sum of it stood up plain for the entire country to read. The goats in the ground and the water had been the ledger all along. The truest ledger ever kept in that dry country, and when the last figure was entered and the books were locked in their case against the weather, that ledger read out clean and final and past all argument. In the plain, hard hand of a woman the whole world had laughed at, it read Elspeth Croft into everything. And it read Cyrus Vane out.